Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Sierra Nevada mountains, deep in the Sequoia National Forest near Kernville, California. I should have listened to the warnings from the ranger station. But when you're young and stupid, you think you're invincible. The four of us, me, Brandon Edwards, Jessica Davis, and Robert Johnson, had been planning this backpacking trip for months. We were all college friends, though we'd graduated 3 years ago and barely saw each other anymore. This trip was supposed to rekindle old bonds, get us away from our mundane office jobs and back to nature. The Kern River Preserve stretched out before us like something from a postcard, all towering sequoias and granite peaks. We'd driven 8 hours from Los Angeles, then hiked another 6 miles into the backcountry to reach our campsite near Tobias Creek. The nearest civilization was Kernville, and that was a solid day's hike away. Jesus, Mike, you sure you read that map right? Brandon wheezed as we finally dropped our packs in a small clearing surrounded by ancient giants. At 32, he was the oldest of our group and had been complaining about his knees for the last 2 miles. Relax, drama queen, I said, consulting my GPS one more time. The little device showed we were exactly where I'd planned, a remote spot I'd found on topographic maps, far from any established trails. We've got 3 days of complete isolation. No cell towers, no tourists, no bullshit. Jessica was already setting up her tent, her red hair catching the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the canopy. She'd always been the practical one, the first to adapt to any situation. I love it, she said, breathing in deeply. You can actually smell the forest instead of car exhaust. Robert, our resident jokester, was making exaggerated huffing sounds as he struggled with his oversized pack. Yeah, smells like pine needles and what's that other smell? Oh right, my impending death from exhaustion. We all laughed, but I noticed something odd. The forest was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, wrong quiet. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals, not even the buzz of insects. Just the distant whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional groan of old wood settling. Hey, I called out to the group as we set up camp. Anyone else notice how quiet it is? Brandon paused in his tent setup. Now that you mention it, yeah, weird. Probably just the altitude, Jessica said, though she glanced around nervously. We're at, what, 7,000 feet? 7,200? According to the GPS, I confirmed, checking the device again. The screen flickered once, showing our coordinates, then went black. Shit. I pressed the power button repeatedly. Nothing. Dead battery, Robert asked, looking over. No, it was fully charged this morning. I tried again, but the screen remained dark. Must be the cold. These things don't work well in extreme temperatures. But it wasn't that cold. Maybe 50 degrees, typical for October in the mountains. We finished setting up camp as the sun began to sink behind the towering peaks. I'd brought a detailed topographic map as backup so the GPS failure wasn't a disaster, just an inconvenience. We built a fire in a ring of stones, cooked our freeze-dried meals, and settled in for our first night in the wilderness. That's when the whistling started. It began as we were cleaning up from dinner, a low, melodic sound drifting through the trees. Not quite a tune, but not random either, like someone calling to something in a language made of wind. What the hell is that? Brandon asked, freezing with a dirty plate in his hands. We all listened. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, shifting direction like smoke. Probably just whined through the rocks, Jessica said, but her voice was tight. That's not wind, Robert said quietly. That's someone whistling. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving us in that wrong kind of silence again. There's nobody else out here, I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. We haven't seen another soul all day." "Could be hunters," Brandon suggested. "Deer season starts next week. But hunters don't whistle in the dark. They know better than to announce their presence to everything in the forest." We tried to dismiss it, focusing on other things. Robert pulled out a deck of cards and we played poker by firelight using pine nuts as chips. But every few minutes, one of us would glance up at the darkness beyond our small circle of light, listening. Around 10 o'clock, my phone died. "What the hell?" I stared at the black screen. This was at 80% an hour ago. "Let me check mine," Jessica said, pulling her device from her pocket. It was dead too. So were Brandon's and Robert's. "All 4 phones." Brandon's voice cracked slightly. "What are the odds of that?" "Maybe there's some kind of electromagnetic interference," I said, grasping for a rational explanation. "Military testing or something." But even as I said it, I knew it sounded weak. We were in the middle of a national forest, not a testing range. The fire began to die down, and when I added more wood, the flames turned an odd blue-green color for a moment before settling back to normal orange. "Did you guys see that?" Jessica whispered. We'd all seen it. None of us had an explanation. "Bad wood," Robert said, but his usual joking tone was forced. Probably some kind of mineral deposit. I'd been camping for 15 years. I'd never seen a fire change colors like that. We decided to turn in early, spooked by the series of small but unsettling events. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the others rustling in their tents, trying to fall asleep. The darkness outside felt different than normal wilderness dark. Hungry. Watching. The whistling came back around midnight. This time it was closer and I could make out a pattern. 3 long notes, then silence, then 3 more. Like a call and response with something in the distance. I unzipped my tent flap quietly and peered out. The fire had died to embers, casting almost no light. I could barely make out the dark shapes of the other tents. "Mike!" Jessica's voice was barely a whisper from her tent. "You hear that?" "Yeah." "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. What do you do when the forest itself seems wrong? The whistling stopped, and this time the silence was even more oppressive. I stayed awake until dawn, listening to nothing. Morning brought relief and embarrassment. In daylight, our fears seemed ridiculous. We made coffee and breakfast, joking about city folks getting spooked by normal forest sounds. "I bet it was just wind through some cave opening," Robert said as he demolished a packet of instant oatmeal. "Sound carries weird in the mountains." "Yeah, and our phones probably died because of the cold," Jessica added. "These things aren't made for wilderness camping." But I noticed she kept checking her dead phone anyway, pressing the power button hopefully. We decided to explore the area, taking a day hike to a ridge about 3 miles north. The map showed a small lake up there, and the weather was perfect for it. We'd been hiking for about an hour when I realized Robert wasn't with us anymore. "Where's Rob?" I asked, stopping and looking back down the trail. Brandon and Jessica turned around, scanning the forest behind us. "He was right behind me 5 minutes ago," Jessica said. "Rob!" I called out. "Rob!" Nothing, not even an echo. "Maybe he stopped to take a leak," Brandon suggested. We waited 10 minutes, then backtracked along the trail. No sign of him. No boot prints leaving the path, no broken branches, nothing. "This doesn't make sense," I said, studying the ground. The trail was soft earth and pine needles. It should show tracks clearly, but there was no indication Robert had ever been there. "Rob!" we called until our throats were raw. The forest swallowed our voices without even an echo. After an hour of searching, we decided to head back to camp. Maybe he'd turned around earlier and we'd somehow missed each other. But when we reached our campsite, Robert wasn't there either. His tent was exactly as we'd left it, his pack untouched. "Okay, this is officially fucked up," Brandon said, pacing around the fire ring. "People don't just vanish." "We need to get help," Jessica said. Hiking back to the road, finding a ranger. "That's a full-day hike," I pointed out. "What if he comes back while we're gone?" What if he doesn't come back at all? She snapped. We argued for 20 minutes before deciding to wait until evening. If Robert didn't return by sunset, we'd pack up and hike out in the morning. But Robert did come back. Just as the sun was setting behind the peaks, he walked into our campsite like nothing had happened. He was carrying an armload of firewood and whistling softly under his breath. "Rob, Jesus Christ, where have you been?" Brandon jumped up from where he'd been sitting by the cold fire ring. Robert looked at us with mild confusion. "Getting firewood. You guys said we needed more." "You've been gone for 8 hours," Jessica said. "8 hours?" Robert frowned, setting down the wood. "No, I just left like 20 minutes ago." I studied his face in the fading light. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. He looked like Robert. Same sandy hair, same brown eyes, same slightly crooked nose from when he'd broken it playing soccer in college. But there was something different about his expression. Too calm, too blank. "Rob, we searched for you all afternoon," I said carefully. "We called your name, followed the trail. Where did you go?" "I told you. I was getting firewood." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Why would you search for me?" "Because you disappeared," Brandon said. "You were behind us on the trail, then you weren't. No tracks, no nothing." Robert stared at us for a long moment, that blank expression never changing. Then he smiled, but it was wrong somehow. Too wide, too long. "I think you guys are confused," he said. "I've been right here the whole time." But that was impossible. We'd been back at the campsite for hours. He definitely hadn't been there. "Rob," Jessica said gently, "are you feeling okay? You seem different." "I feel fine." The smile never wavered. "Never better, actually." He began arranging the firewood with mechanical precision, stacking it in a perfect pyramid. His movements were too deliberate, too controlled. Robert was usually a sloppy person. He left dishes in the sink for days, and his apartment was always a disaster. This obsessive neatness was completely out of character. "Where exactly did you find this wood?" I asked, examining the pieces he'd brought back. They were all the same length, perfectly uniform, as if they'd been cut with a saw rather than gathered from the forest floor. "In the woods," he said without looking up. "Which woods? North? South? Near the creek?" "Just in the woods." I exchanged glances with Brandon and Jessica. Robert's usual verbose, joking personality had vanished completely. He spoke only when spoken to, and then in the shortest possible sentences. As he worked on the fire, I noticed other changes. He wasn't blinking enough, maybe once every minute or two, when it should have been every few seconds. And when he did blink, it was slow and deliberate, like he had to think about it. "Hey, Rob," Brandon said, "remember that time in college when you got so drunk you tried to order pizza from the emergency phone in the dorm lobby?" Robert paused in his fire building. "I don't remember that." "Come on, man. You told that story at my wedding last year. You said it was the most embarrassing thing you'd ever done." "I don't remember your wedding either." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Brandon's face went pale. "Rob," Jessica said carefully, "what's my middle name?" Another long pause. "I don't know." "It's Anne. You've known me for 10 years. You were there when I got it tattooed on my wrist after my grandmother died." Robert looked at her wrist, where the small script tattoo was clearly visible in the firelight. "Oh," he said. "Anne." But there was no recognition in his voice. He was just repeating the word back to us. "Okay, what the fuck is going on?" Brandon demanded. "Are you having some kind of breakdown? Did you hit your head out there?" "I'm fine," Robert said, and lit the fire. It caught immediately, burning with that same blue-green tinge we'd seen the night before. As the flames danced, I caught a glimpse of Robert's face in the flickering light. For just a moment, his eyes reflected the fire like an animal's. Bright yellow-green, inhuman. I blinked, and they were normal brown again. "I think we should pack up and hike out first thing in the morning," I said quietly to Brandon and Jessica while Robert continued to stare into the fire. "What about Rob?" Jessica whispered. I looked at the thing sitting by our campfire, wearing my friend's face and clothes. "I don't think that's Rob anymore." We spent the night in terror. Robert never went to his tent. He just sat by the fire, unmoving, staring into the flames. When I peeked out of my tent around 2 a.m., he was in the exact same position, like a statue, and he was whistling, that same 3-note pattern we'd heard the night before. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. We packed our gear as quietly as possible, whispering plans to slip away while Robert was distracted. But when we shouldered our packs and started toward the trail, he was suddenly there, blocking our path. "Where are you going?" he asked in that flat, emotionless voice. "We're hiking out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The trip's over, Rob. Time to go home. But we just got here." He tilted his head at an unnatural angle, like a bird studying an insect. "Why would you want to leave?" "Because something's wrong with you," Brandon said bluntly. "You're not acting like yourself." Robert's smile returned, stretching wider than any human smile should. "I'm exactly myself. I've never been more myself." In the morning light, I could see details I'd missed the night before. His skin had a grayish pallor, and there were dark veins visible beneath the surface. His fingernails had grown longer overnight, yellowed and sharp. And when he spoke, I caught glimpses of teeth that were too pointed. Too many. "Rob," Jessica said, "please let us pass. We're worried about you. We want to get you help." "Help?" The thing that looked like Robert laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I don't need help. I need—" He paused, sniffing the air like a dog. "I need to eat." That's when we ran. I grabbed Jessica's hand and bolted into the forest, crashing through undergrowth with Brandon close behind. Behind us, Robert, or whatever was wearing his body, let out a sound that was part howl, part scream, part something else entirely. We ran blindly, thorns tearing at our clothes and faces, low branches whipping against us. I could hear it following, moving through the forest with impossible speed, never quite catching up but never falling behind either. "The trail!" Brandon gasped, pointing ahead through the trees. "If we can reach the main trail." We burst out of the underbrush onto the packed earth of the hiking path, our lungs burning. I pulled out my backup compass, trying to orient ourselves. South toward the trailhead, toward civilization, toward help. But when I looked at the compass, the needle was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "Which way?" Jessica panted. I looked up and down the trail. It stretched in both directions, disappearing into identical forest. Nothing looked familiar. According to my mental map, we should be able to see the ridge we'd climbed yesterday from here. But the landscape was wrong. Different. "I don't know," I admitted. The whistling started again, closer now, and there were answers coming from other directions. Multiple voices all around us. "Oh God," Jessica whispered. "There are more of them." Through the trees, I caught glimpses of movement. Pale shapes that might have been human, if humans moved like that. If humans could bend their limbs at those angles. "This way," I said, picking a direction at random. We ran down the trail, our heavy packs bouncing painfully against our backs. Behind us, the whistling grew louder, and underneath it, a new sound. Chewing. Wet, crunching sounds like someone eating raw meat. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The Robert thing was following us, but it was no longer trying to maintain its human disguise. It moved on all fours now, its spine bent at impossible angles, its arms and legs stretched too long. Its face was still Robert's, but the mouth had opened far too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. And it was feeding on something. Something with brown fur and 4 legs that might have been a deer. Blood dripped from its chin as it ran. "Don't look back," I gasped to the others. "Just run!" The trail began to climb, and our pace slowed despite our terror. The things behind us could move faster, but they seemed to be playing with us, staying just close enough to keep us running without actually catching us. We crested a small hill and found ourselves looking down into a valley that shouldn't exist. According to my map, this area was supposed to be a gradual slope toward Kernville. Instead, we were looking at a deep bowl filled with dead trees and standing water. The air rising from it smelled like rot and old bones. "That's not right," Brandon said, checking his own map with shaking hands. "This place isn't on here." "None of this is right," Jessica said. "It's like the whole forest changed overnight." The whistling was getting closer. We had to make a choice: go down into that nightmare valley or try to find another way around. That's when I saw the cabin. It was tucked back in the trees at the edge of the valley, half hidden by shadows and overgrowth. Rustic logs, a stone chimney, broken windows, abandoned, but it might offer shelter. "There," I pointed, "we can hide in there until they pass." It was a desperate plan, but better than being caught in the open. We stumbled down the slope toward the cabin, our legs shaking with exhaustion. The door was unlocked, hanging open on rusted hinges. Inside was one room with a stone fireplace, a few pieces of rotting furniture, and evidence that someone had lived here once. But it had been empty for years, or so we thought. As we barricaded the door with a heavy table, Jessica found the journal. It was sitting on the mantelpiece, leather-bound and surprisingly well-preserved despite the moisture and decay everywhere else. The pages were filled with handwriting and faded ink. "Listen to this," she said, reading by the dim light filtering through the broken windows. "Day 12 in the woods. The whistling came again last night. Tommy went to investigate and hasn't come back. When I called his name, something answered, but it wasn't his voice." My blood turned to ice. "Keep reading." "Day 15. Tommy returned this morning, but it's not Tommy. It looks like him, talks like him sometimes, but it's wrong. The real Tommy had a scar on his chin from when he fell off his bike as a kid. This thing doesn't have the scar, and its eyes, God, its eyes are wrong." Brandon was at the window watching the forest. "How old is that journal?" Jessica flipped to the front cover. "It's dated 1987, but that's impossible. This place should be marked on our maps if people lived here in the 80s. Day 18, she continued reading. "It's not just Tommy anymore. Sarah went missing yesterday, and Mark the day before. They keep coming back, but they're not them. They smile too much. They don't remember things they should remember, and they're always hungry." Outside, the whistling stopped. In the sudden silence, we could hear something moving around the cabin, footsteps that were almost human, circling us like a predator. Day 20. Jessica's voice was barely a whisper now. "I understand now. There's something in these woods that takes people. Not kills them, takes them, wears them, feeds through them. The Ojibwe have a word for it: Wendigo, a cannibal spirit that possesses the living and turns them into monsters." A scratching sound started at the door, slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. "I'm the only real one left. The others, the things that look like my friends, they know I know. They're trying to get in. If someone finds this journal, get out. Get out now. Don't let them take you back to where they came from. Don't let them—" The entry ended mid-sentence. The rest of the pages were blank except for dark stains that might have been blood. The scratching at the door stopped, replaced by Robert's voice. But it was different now. Layered, like multiple people speaking in unison. "Mike? Brandon? Jessica? I know you're in there. Why are you hiding from me?" We pressed ourselves against the back wall, not daring to breathe. "I just want to talk, to explain. You're my friends. I would never hurt you." But underneath the familiar words was something else, a wet, hungry sound, like drooling. "I know you're scared," the voice continued, "but there's nothing to be afraid of. It doesn't hurt. You just stop being you and start being something better. Something that's never hungry, never tired, never alone." A new voice joined Robert's. A woman's voice, but distorted and wrong. "Jessica? It's Sarah Mitchell. I used to live here with my friends, just like you. But I'm better now. We're all better now. Don't you want to be better too?" "That's impossible," Jessica whispered. "The journal said this happened in 1987. Sarah would be dead by now." "Not dead," came another voice from outside. Male, older, changed, improved. "The forest takes care of us, feeds us. We're part of it now." More voices joined the chorus. Dozens of them, all speaking in that same unnaturally harmonious way. Men, women, children, people who had vanished in these woods over the decades, all of them still here, still hungry. "Come out," they said together. "Join us. It's so much easier than fighting." Through the broken windows I could see shapes moving in the gathering dusk. Pale, twisted figures that might once have been human. Some were recent, still recognizably people. Others had been here longer, their forms stretched and distorted beyond easy recognition. But they all had the same eyes, yellow-green and hungry. "We need to get out of here," I whispered. "How?" Brandon hissed back. "They're everywhere." I looked around the cabin desperately, searching for another exit. There was a back window, partially boarded up but maybe big enough to squeeze through. "There," I pointed, "and we go out the back, try to circle around to the trail." "And then what? We're lost, remember? Our compass doesn't work. Our maps are wrong." "Then we pick a direction and keep walking until we find something. Anything's better than staying here." Jessica was still clutching the journal. "Wait, listen to this. There's more writing on the back cover, different handwriting." She read in a barely audible whisper. "If you're reading this, I made it out. Barely. The Wendigo, that's what it is, I'm sure now. It can only fully possess you if you stop fighting, if you give up hope. As long as you remember who you are, hold on to your memories, your identity, it can't complete the transformation. The ones outside are the people who gave up. Don't give up." Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, October 1987. "So, there is a way out," Brandon said. "If we don't give up," I said. "If we keep fighting." The voices outside were getting impatient. The harmonious chorus was breaking down into individual sounds. Growling, snapping, the wet, tearing sounds of feeding. "Come out now," Robert's voice demanded, no longer trying to sound friendly. "Come out, or we'll come in." Something heavy slammed against the door. The rotting wood splintered and the table we'd used as a barricade slid back several inches. "Now," I said. We rushed to the back window. I kicked out the remaining boards while Brandon and Jessica grabbed our packs. The opening was tight, but we managed to squeeze through one by one, tumbling out into the darkening forest. Behind us, the door gave way with a crash of splintering wood. We ran without looking back, crashing through the underbrush in the opposite direction from the trail. If we were lost anyway, it didn't matter which way we went. The important thing was distance. The forest was alive with sounds now. Howls and screams and that terrible harmonious whistling. They were hunting us properly now, no longer playing games. I led us up a steep slope, hoping elevation might give us some advantage. My lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly, but terror kept me moving. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. At the top of the ridge, we found something impossible. A road. It was overgrown and cracked, obviously abandoned for years, but it was definitely human-made. 2 lanes of crumbling asphalt stretching through the forest. "How is there a road up here?" Jessica panted. "This area is supposed to be pristine wilderness." "Who cares?" Brandon said. "Roads lead somewhere. Follow it." We stumbled along the broken pavement, using our flashlights sparingly to conserve battery. The pursuing sounds fell behind, as if the creatures were reluctant to follow us onto the road. After what felt like hours, we saw lights ahead. A building of some kind, blazing with electric illumination that seemed impossibly bright after days in the wilderness. As we got closer, I could make out details. It was a gas station, complete with pumps and a convenience store. A big sign proclaimed "Last Stop Gas and Food, next services 127 miles." "Thank God," Jessica sobbed. "Civilization." But something felt wrong about it. The lights were too bright, too new. The building looked freshly built, not weathered by mountain winters. And there were no cars in the parking lot despite it being the only business for hundreds of miles. Still, we were desperate. We stumbled across the empty parking lot toward the front door, which was propped open with a sign that read, "24 hours, come on in." Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh white light. The shelves were fully stocked with food and supplies, but there was no one behind the counter. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone here?" Silence, but I could hear something in the back room, a wet, rhythmic sound like chewing. "Maybe they're in the bathroom," Brandon suggested, but his voice was shaky. Jessica was examining the merchandise on the shelves. "This is weird. Look at the expiration dates on this stuff. 1987. Everything here expired in 1987. I looked closer. She was right. Canned goods, snack foods, even the newspapers by the register were all from October 1987, the same time period as the journal we'd found. The chewing sounds from the back room got louder, and underneath them, a familiar, harmonious humming. "We need to go," I said. "Now." But when I turned toward the door, Robert was standing there, blocking our exit. Except it wasn't trying to look like Robert anymore. The thing had grown taller, its limbs stretched and jointless. Its face was still recognizably Robert's, but the mouth had split open horizontally across the entire lower half of its head, revealing a cavern full of teeth. "Welcome to our home," it said in that multi-layered voice. "We've been waiting so long for new friends." More figures emerged from between the shelves. The Seraph from the journal, now 40 years corrupted and barely human. The Tommy thing, its body twisted into something that might once have been a child. Dozens of others, people who had vanished in these woods over the decades. "You can't escape," they said in unison. "This is our place, our hunting ground. You're part of it now." I backed against the counter, looking desperately for a weapon. My hand fell on something heavy. A tire iron left beside the register. "Remember who you are," I said to Brandon and Jessica. "Hold on to your memories. Don't let them take that." The Robert thing laughed to sound like breaking bones. "Your memories won't help you. This place doesn't follow your rules. Time doesn't work here like it does in your world. We've been hunting you for 40 years. "That's impossible," Jessica said. "We only got here yesterday." "Did you? Are you sure? Think carefully. When did you really arrive?" I tried to remember, but the memories felt slippery, uncertain. Had we hiked in yesterday? Or was it longer ago? The days seemed to blur together. "Don't listen to it," I said, gripping the tire iron. "It's trying to confuse us." But doubt was creeping in. How long had we been running? How many times had we slept? The journal said the possessed ones could only take you if you gave up hope, if you stopped fighting. But what if they were right? What if we'd already been here for years, going through the same cycle over and over? "Look at yourselves," the creatures said. "Look at your hands." I looked down and nearly dropped the tire iron. My hands were pale, grayish. Dark veins showed clearly under the skin, just like Robert's had been. Brandon and Jessica were changing too. Their skin had the same pallor, the same creeping darkness. "No," I said. "This isn't real. You're making us see things." "We don't make anyone see anything," the Robert thing said. "We just help you understand what you already are." My mind raced, trying to hold on to something real. My name was Michael Williams. I was 28 years old. I worked at an insurance company in Los Angeles. I had a girlfriend named... I couldn't remember her name. "That's it," the creatures crooned. "Let it go. It's easier this way." But something stopped me from giving in completely. A fragment of memory, bright and clear. The journal. The woman who had escaped. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison. She'd made it out. She'd written that note on the back cover. If she could escape, so could we. Jessica, I said urgently, tell me about your grandmother, the one who died. What was her name? Jessica blinked, struggling to focus. Anna. Her name was Anna. She taught me to knit. She made the best apple pie. The creatures hissed, recoiling slightly as Jessica spoke. Brandon, I continued, your wedding, where was it held? The country club, he said slowly, outside Portland. It rained, but Sarah, my wife Sarah, she said it was good luck. The hissing grew louder. The fluorescent lights flickered. My girlfriend's name is Rebecca, I said, the memory suddenly crystal clear. Rebecca Chen. We met at a bookstore. She's probably worried sick about us. The gas station began to waver around us like a mirage. The walls became translucent and I could see the real forest beyond. Dawn was breaking and we were standing in an empty clearing. You can't leave, the creatures shrieked, their forms becoming more and more distorted. You belong to us. But as we held on to our memories, our identities, their power over us weakened. The Robert thing made one last desperate lunge, but I swung the tire iron, which had become a solid tree branch in my hands, and connected with its skull. The impact sent it sprawling. Run! I shouted. We burst out of the dissolving illusion and into the real forest. Behind us, the creatures' screams of rage echoed through the trees, but they couldn't follow us into the daylight. They were things of darkness and confusion, and the morning sun stripped away their power. We found the real trail an hour later, marked with official Forest Service signs and well-maintained. It led us down to a ranger station where we stumbled out of the woods, babbling about monsters and possessed friends. The rangers searched for Robert, of course. They found our original campsite, but no sign of our missing friend. The official report stated that Robert Johnson had become separated from his group and likely fell into one of the many deep crevasses in the area. His body was never recovered. But I know the truth. He's still out there, in that wrong place between the real forest and the nightmare, still hunting with the others who gave up their humanity for eternal hunger. I never went camping again. None of us did. Brandon moved to Florida and won't even go into city parks after dark. Jessica became a workaholic, afraid of any empty spaces. We don't talk about what happened. Who would believe us? But sometimes, late at night, I hear whistling outside my apartment window. 3 long notes, then silence, then 3 more. And I know they haven't forgotten us. They're still waiting, hoping we'll give up our memories and join them in their endless hunger. I check my phone obsessively to make sure it stays charged. I keep detailed journals to anchor my memories. And I never, ever whistle back. Because I know that somewhere in the Sierra Nevada mountains, in a place that exists between the real world and nightmare, my friend Robert is still out there, still hungry, still calling for us to come home. My name is Daniel Lopez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Marble Mountain Wilderness, deep in the Klamath National Forest of Northern California, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day backpacking trip with my closest friends. I should have known something was wrong when Michael Williams started talking about the old Karuk legends during our drive up Highway 96. Michael was a software engineer from San Jose, the kind of guy who lived on energy drinks and believed only in what he could code into existence. For him to suddenly start spouting off about ancient Native American folklore about cannibalistic spirits was unsettling. The Karuk people have stories about these mountains, he said, his eyes never leaving the winding mountain road. They say there are places where hunger itself takes physical form, where people who cross certain lines become something else entirely. Sarah Rodriguez, sitting in the passenger seat, rolled her eyes. Since when do you care about local folklore, Mike? You're the guy who thinks ghost stories are just bad programming in people's brains. Michael shrugged, but I caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. Something flickered across his face, a hunger that made my stomach clench. I've been reading about it online. There were disappearances up here in the 1800s. Gold miners who went into the mountains and came back? Different, if they came back at all. The September afternoon was dying as we pulled into the trailhead parking area near Lover's Camp. The air carried the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and organic that made me think of old blood. Sarah wrinkled her nose. God, what is that smell? Probably just decomposing leaves, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew I was lying to myself. The smell was wrong. It was the smell of meat left too long in the sun. We shouldered our packs and started up the trail toward our planned campsite near Spirit Lake. The trail was well maintained for the first few miles, but as we climbed higher into the wilderness, the path became increasingly overgrown. Branches seemed to reach for us with grasping fingers, and more than once I felt something brush against my neck when there was nothing there. "This GPS is acting weird," Sarah said, stopping to check her phone. "It keeps showing us in different locations. A minute ago it said we were 5 miles southeast of here." Michael checked his phone too. "Mine's dead. That's weird. I charged it to full this morning." My phone showed no signal and a battery that had mysteriously drained from 100% to 12% in the span of an hour. A cold knot formed in my stomach, but I pushed it down. Electronic malfunctions happened in the mountains. Solar activity, magnetic fields, whatever. We pressed on as the shadows lengthened. The forest around us grew unnaturally quiet. No bird songs, no insect chatter, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just our footsteps and the sound of our increasingly labored breathing. As the sun dipped below the tree line, we reached what should have been Spirit Lake according to our topographic map. Instead, we found a dry depression filled with bleached stones and the scattered bones of various animals. The bones were wrong, though gnawed and cracked with long scratch marks that looked almost like teeth marks. "This can't be right," Sarah said, consulting the map. "Spirit Lake should be here. It's fed by snowmelt from Black Marble Mountain." "Maybe it's seasonal," I suggested, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. The bones told a different story. Something had been feeding here, and recently. We made camp on the far side of the dry lake bed, as far from the bone pile as possible. Michael volunteered to gather firewood while Sarah and I set up the tents. As he disappeared into the tree line, that metallic smell seemed to intensify. "Danny," Sarah said quietly, "I don't like this place. Something feels wrong." I looked at her pale face in the gathering gloom. Sarah was tough. She'd grown up camping with her father in the Sierras, had climbed Half Dome solo, had never been spooked by a night in the wilderness. If she was nervous, I should be terrified. "We can head back first thing in the morning," I told her. "Make it a short trip." She nodded, but kept glancing toward the tree line where Michael had vanished. He's been gone a while. 20 minutes passed, then 30. I called his name and my voice echoed strangely among the trees, as if the forest was swallowing the sound. When the echo came back, it sounded different, deeper, hungrier. "Michael!" Sarah shouted. "Where are you?" A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp, followed by what sounded like dragging footsteps. Michael emerged from the trees carrying an armload of deadfall, but something was off about the way he moved. His gait was too fluid, too predatory. In the dying light, his eyes seemed to reflect our headlamp beams like an animal's. "Sorry," he said, his voice oddly flat. "Got turned around. These woods are confusing." He dropped the wood near our fire ring, and I noticed his hands were stained with something dark. When I asked about it, he looked down as if seeing them for the first time. "Must be tree sap," he said, but made no move to wash them off. The fire caught quickly, too quickly, with flames that burned an unnatural blue-green color before settling to normal orange. Michael sat across from us, staring into the flames with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He hadn't touched the trail mix or energy bars we'd brought for dinner. "Aren't you hungry?" Sarah asked. Michael turned his head toward her with a motion that was just a little too smooth, a little too sharp. "I am," he said. "Very hungry, but not for that." The way he said it made every hair on my body stand up. Sarah and I exchanged glances, and I saw my own growing alarm reflected in her eyes. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped faster than it should have. Our breath began to fog, and frost started forming on the outside of our tents despite the fact that it had been nearly 70 degrees during the day. The fire kept dying down no matter how much wood we added, as if something was actively draining the heat from it. "I'm going to bed," Sarah announced around 10 o'clock, zipping herself into her tent with obvious relief. I wanted to follow her lead, but something kept me sitting by the dwindling fire with Michael. He hadn't moved in over an hour, hadn't blinked, just stared into the flames with that awful, hungry expression. "Mike," I said softly, "you okay, man?" His head swiveled toward me, and in the firelight I saw that his pupils had dilated until they nearly swallowed his irises. When he smiled, his teeth looked longer than they should have. "I've never been better, Danny. I've never been so aware. Do you know what it's like to finally understand what you're meant to be?" "What are you talking about?" "The hunger, Danny. It's not just about food. It's about becoming something more than human. Something that doesn't have to live by human rules." The fire guttered and died, plunging us into absolute darkness. I fumbled for my headlamp, but before I could turn it on, I heard Michael stand up. His movement was completely silent. No rustling of clothes, no creak of joints, just the displacement of air. "Michael?" My voice cracked like a teenager's. I finally got my headlamp on and swept the beam around our campsite. Michael was gone. His tent was still there, sleeping bag unrolled, but he had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. I crawled over to Sarah's tent and whispered her name urgently. When she unzipped the door, her face was pale with terror. "Danny, thank God. I've been hearing things, scratching around my tent. And laughing. But not normal laughing. It sounds like what? Like someone learning how to laugh, like they're practicing the sound." We huddled together in her tent, listening to the sounds outside. Footsteps circled our camp, sometimes heavy, sometimes light as air. Occasionally, we heard Michael's voice calling our names, but it was wrong. The tone was right, but the rhythm was off, like someone doing a poor impression. "Danny, Sarah, come out and play." The voice was getting closer to Sarah's tent. I could see the fabric dimpling inward as something pressed against it from outside. "We know you're in there," the Michael thing said, and now the voice had changed completely. It was deeper, rougher, like gravel being ground between massive teeth. "We can smell your fear, your meat, your life." Sarah grabbed my arm so hard her nails drew blood. "That's not Michael," she whispered. "We know," said the voice outside, and it was right at the tent entrance now. "Michael is sleeping, but we wear his face so well, don't we? We've been practicing." The zipper began to open by itself, metal teeth separating with agonizing slowness. I grabbed my hunting knife and put myself between Sarah and the entrance, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something that could be stopped with steel. A pale hand reached through the opening. Michael's hand, but wrong. The fingers were too long, the nails too sharp, and the skin had a waxy, translucent quality that made the veins beneath clearly visible. When it touched the tent floor, the fabric began to smoke and curl as if burned by acid. "Let us in," the thing wearing Michael's voice pleaded. "We're so hungry, and you smell so warm." I slashed at the hand with my knife, and the blade passed right through it as if cutting air. The thing laughed. That awful, practiced sound Sarah had described, and suddenly the hand solidified again, grabbing my wrist with inhuman strength. "Daniel!" it hissed, and Michael's face appeared in the tent opening. But it was Michael as painted by someone who had never seen a human before. The proportions were slightly off. the expression too intense, the eyes far too aware of what lay behind them. "Why do you resist? We could make you like us. No more fear, no more weakness, only hunger and the satisfaction of feeding." "Get away from us," Sarah screamed, but her voice broke halfway through. The Michael thing tilted its head at an angle that would have snapped a human neck. "Sarah," it said lovingly, "beautiful Sarah, you will taste like copper and dreams." That's when the tent suddenly collapsed on us, heavy fabric pressing down like a burial shroud. I heard Sarah scream and felt her being dragged away from me. I fought my way out of the tangle of nylon and aluminum poles to find the Michael thing holding her off the ground by her throat. But it wasn't just holding her. Its fingers had extended into claws that pierced her neck, and dark blood was running down her chest. She was still alive, still struggling, but I could see the life leaving her eyes. "Let her go," I shouted, raising my knife. The thing looked at me over Sarah's shoulder and smiled with Michael's mouth. "We told you, Daniel. Steel cannot harm us, but if you wish to try." It released Sarah, who crumpled to the ground, clutching her throat. Blood bubbled between her fingers, but she was breathing. The thing that wore Michael's face stepped toward me, and with each step its appearance became more and more wrong. Limbs stretched, joints bent in directions they shouldn't. Skin grew pale and tight over suddenly prominent bones. "This is what your friend has become," it said in Michael's voice. "This is what we offered him, and he accepted gladly. The hunger was always there, Daniel. We simply unlocked it." The thing lunged at me with speed that should have been impossible. I threw myself sideways and rolled, coming up near the fire ring. My hand closed on a piece of burning wood. The fire had somehow rekindled itself while we were in the tent. When I swung the burning brand at the creature, it shrieked and stumbled backward. Where the flames touched it, its stolen flesh bubbled and peeled away, revealing something underneath that hurt to look at directly. "Fire!" I screamed to Sarah. "It doesn't like fire." She was on her feet now, blood still seeping through her fingers but moving with desperate purpose. She grabbed another burning stick from the fire and joined me in keeping the thing at bay. It circled us like a predator, sometimes wearing Michael's face, sometimes letting the mask slip to reveal glimpses of what lay beneath. I caught sight of too many teeth, of eyes like black holes, of limbs that bent in geometrically impossible ways. "You cannot burn forever," it said in a voice like breaking glass. "The wood will run out, the fire will die, and we will still be hungry." It was right. We had maybe an hour's worth of firewood left, and dawn was still hours away. But as I looked around desperately for more fuel, I noticed something odd about the bone pile at the center of the dried lake bed. In the firelight, I could see that the bones weren't randomly scattered. They formed a pattern, a circle within a circle with symbols scratched into the stones between them. "Sarah," I said quietly, "I think this isn't just a feeding ground. I think it's a trap." She followed my gaze and gasped. "Those are Karuk symbols. My grandmother taught me some of them when I was little. That one there, it means binding, and that one means hunger that cannot be satisfied." The Michael thing had stopped circling. It was listening to us with obvious interest. "A prison," I realized. "This whole area is a prison. Someone trapped it here." "But not well enough," the creature hissed. "Binding fades with time. Blood renews it. We have been economical with our feeding to avoid attracting attention. But 3 fresh souls, 3 willing vessels, that would give us strength to break free entirely." The fire was burning lower. Soon we'd be defenseless. "The symbols," Sarah whispered urgently. "If we could complete the binding—" "With what? We don't have the right tools, don't know the right words." "Blood," she said, looking at the wounds on her neck. "It wants blood to break free. Maybe blood can also renew the binding." It was insane, but as the fire died to glowing embers and the thing wearing Michael's face crept closer, insanity seemed like our only option. "Stay here," I told her. "Keep it distracted." I sprinted toward the bone circle, the creature's roar of fury echoing behind me. I heard Sarah scream and the sound of pursuit, but I didn't look back. The symbols carved into the stones were crude but purposeful. I pressed my cut palm against the first symbol, letting my blood drip into the carved grooves. The effect was immediate. The thing shrieked as if in physical pain, and when I looked back, I saw it writhing on the ground, its stolen form flickering between Michael's appearance and something far worse. "It's working!" Sarah shouted. "Keep going!" I moved to the next symbol, then the next, leaving a trail of blood in each carved line. With every symbol I completed, the creature's screams grew more desperate. But it was also fighting back, and I could feel its will pressing against mine like a physical weight. "You cannot hold us," it snarled, its voice now completely inhuman. "We have fed on a dozen souls over the decades. We grow stronger with each feeding. And when we break free, then you'll have to find someone else to eat," I said, pressing my bleeding palm to the final symbol. The bone circle erupted with pale, cold light. The creature's scream became something beyond sound, a vibration that I felt in my bones, in my teeth, in the spaces between my thoughts. The thing that had been pretending to be Michael was pulled backward as if by invisible chains, its form unraveling like smoke in a hurricane. "This is not over," it howled as it was dragged into the circle of bones. "The binding will weaken again. Someone will always be hungry enough to listen. Someone will always." The light died. The bones settled into a new configuration, tighter than before, with my blood glowing briefly in the carved symbols before fading to darkness. In the sudden silence, I heard Sarah sobbing. She was kneeling beside something near the edge of our camp, and when I approached, I saw what remained of Michael. His body was intact but wrong, twisted and desiccated, as if something had sucked all the life out of him from the inside. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. "How long?" Sarah whispered. "How long was that thing wearing his face?" I thought about Michael's strange mood during the drive, his talk of local legends, the hunger I'd seen flickering in his eyes. "Maybe from the beginning," I said. "Maybe it called to him before we even got here." We stayed by the fire until dawn, taking turns keeping watch and feeding the flames. Neither of us spoke much. What was there to say? Our friend was dead, killed by something that shouldn't exist, in a place that was supposed to be a simple camping trip. When the sun finally rose, we packed our gear in silence and started the hike back to the trailhead. The forest seemed normal again. Birds singing, insects buzzing. The sounds of life returning to a place that had been temporarily claimed by something antithetical to life itself. But as we reached the parking lot and loaded our packs into my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That somewhere in the depths of the Marble Mountain wilderness, something was testing the strength of its renewed bonds and finding them adequate. For now. The drive home was a blur of police reports and carefully edited stories. We told them Michael had fallen while gathering firewood, that we'd found his body the next morning. The medical examiner ruled it an accidental death caused by blunt force trauma, and no one questioned why he'd been found nearly a quarter mile from the nearest cliff. Sarah moved to Portland a month later. We still exchange emails occasionally, but we never talk about what really happened that night. Some experiences are too raw, too fundamentally wrong, to be shared with anyone who wasn't there. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself researching missing persons cases in remote wilderness areas, looking for patterns, looking for signs that the bindings are weakening again. Because the thing was right about one thing: someone will always be hungry enough to listen. And next time, there might not be anyone left who knows how to renew the trap. I keep a bag packed in my closet now: camping gear, first aid supplies, and a knife that I've blessed by 3 different religious traditions, just in case, because I know that someday I'll get a call about missing hikers in the Marble Mountains, and I'll have to go back. The hunger never truly dies. It only sleeps, waiting for someone foolish enough to wake it up. And in my darkest moments, I wonder if part of Michael is still trapped in there with it, screaming silently in whatever passes for that thing's memory. I wonder if, when the bindings finally fail and it breaks free, it will come looking for the ones who trapped it. I wonder if it will be wearing Michael's face when it finds me. My name is Daniel Lopez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Desolation Valley, deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my college friends. I should have known something was wrong when Marcus Chen's GPS started glitching on the drive up. The device kept insisting we were in the middle of Lake Tahoe, even though we could see the dense pine forest stretching endlessly around Highway 89. But we were all eager to escape our cubicle jobs in Sacramento, and the promise of untouched wilderness made us push forward despite the technological hiccups. "Maybe it's just the altitude," said Rebecca Hill, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she studied the paper map spread across her lap. At 26, she was the most organized of our group, always prepared with backup plans and emergency supplies. "We're at 7,000 feet now." "Since when do you believe in altitude affecting electronics?" laughed Kevin King from the passenger seat. Kevin was our eternal optimist, the kind of guy who saw adventure in every mishap. His sandy hair caught the afternoon sunlight as he turned to grin at us. "Besides, when's the last time any of us actually disconnected? This could be good for us." Marcus, our designated driver and amateur outdoorsman, gripped the steering wheel tighter as another switchback appeared ahead. The ranger station said to follow the fire road for 12 miles past Emerald Bay, then look for the marked trail to Desolation Valley. We should be close. I pressed my face against the window, watching the trees grow denser and more twisted as we climbed higher. Something about their shapes bothered me. The way their branches seemed to reach inward rather than outward, creating a canopy so thick it blocked most of the sky. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since leaving the main highway, and shadows pooled between the trunks like spilled ink. "There," Rebecca pointed ahead. "Trail marker." The wooden sign was weathered nearly smooth, but we could make out Desolation Valley, 3.2 miles, carved into the rotting wood. Below it, someone had scratched additional words that were too faded to read clearly. We pulled into a small dirt clearing that served as a makeshift parking area. As Marcus shut off the engine, the silence hit us like a physical weight. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, no distant traffic hum. Just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against our eardrums. "Wow," Kevin said, but his usual enthusiasm sounded forced. "Really gets you back to nature, doesn't it?" We unloaded our gear in that unnatural silence. My backpack felt heavier than usual, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder at the tree line. The shadows between the pines seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The trail was well marked initially, with worn wooden posts every few hundred yards. But as we hiked deeper into the valley, the markers became more scarce and the path itself began to fade. The forest floor was carpeted with a thick layer of brown pine needles that muffled our footsteps, making it feel like we were walking through a soundproof chamber. "Is it just me? Or does it feel like we're being watched?" Rebecca whispered after we'd been hiking for about an hour. I'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to say it aloud. The sensation was constant now, a prickling awareness between my shoulder blades, as if invisible eyes were tracking our every movement. "It's probably just deer," Marcus said, though he kept glancing nervously at the darkening forest around us. "Mountain wildlife can be pretty curious about humans." "Deer don't watch like this," Kevin muttered. "This feels intelligent." The trail split ahead of us with no marker to indicate which path led to our destination. Marcus checked his GPS again, cursing under his breath. "Still showing us in the middle of a lake," he said, "and my phone has no signal at all now." Rebecca consulted the paper map, rotating it to match our apparent direction of travel. "According to this, we should take the left fork. It should lead us down into the valley proper." The left path descended steeply through a grove of massive cedar trees, their trunks so wide that 4 people couldn't have linked arms around them. As we walked between these ancient giants, the quality of light changed dramatically. What little sunlight filtered through the canopy took on a sickly yellow-green tint, and the air grew noticeably colder. "How old do you think these trees are?" Rebecca asked, running her hand along the deeply grooved bark of a particularly massive cedar. "Some of these could be over 1,000 years old," Marcus replied. "The Native Americans in this area considered groves like this to be sacred, said they were home to things that shouldn't be disturbed." "Great," Kevin said with a nervous laugh. "Thanks for mentioning that after we're already committed to camping here." As if summoned by his words, a sound echoed through the trees ahead of us. A long, low moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We all froze, straining to listen. "Wind," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. The air was completely still. The sound came again, closer this time, with an unmistakably organic quality that made my skin crawl. It rose and fell like breathing, but far too deep and slow for any animal I could imagine. "Maybe we should reconsider this spot," Rebecca said quietly. But we were already 2 hours deep into the wilderness, and turning back would mean hiking in darkness on unfamiliar trails. Marcus made the decision for us. "We're almost to the valley floor," he said, pointing ahead where the trees began to thin. "Let's at least check it out. If it feels too weird, we can hike back out tomorrow morning." The Desolation Valley opened before us like a vast amphitheater carved from the mountainside. It was perhaps 2 miles across, ringed by steep granite cliffs that rose 500 feet on all sides. The valley floor was relatively flat, covered in sparse grass and scattered with large granite boulders. A small stream meandered through the center, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like stepping into a trap. "Well," Kevin said, his voice echoing strangely in the open space, "it's certainly isolated." We made camp near the stream, about a 1/4 mile from the tree line. As the sun began to set behind the western rim of the valley, long shadows crept across the grass toward our small cluster of tents. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared, and we huddled around our campfire as full darkness settled over us. That's when the sounds began. At first, it was just the occasional crack of a branch or rustle of leaves from the surrounding forest. But as the night deepened, the noises became more purposeful, more organized. Footsteps that would start on one side of our camp and stop abruptly when we tried to locate them. Whispers in a language none of us recognized, carried on wind that we couldn't feel. "Did anyone else hear that?" Rebecca asked around midnight, her voice tight with fear. We'd all heard it, a sound like someone calling our names from the darkness beyond the firelight, but the voices were wrong somehow, distorted and hollow. "It's just the acoustics," Marcus said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Sound bounces weird in a valley like this." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. We all could. Kevin volunteered to take the first watch, insisting that the rest of us needed sleep. I crawled into my tent but found sleep impossible. Every small noise seemed amplified. The whisper of wind through grass, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft splash of something moving in the stream. Around 2 a.m., I heard Kevin call out softly from beside the fire. "Guys, you might want to see this." I unzipped my tent and crawled out to find Kevin staring intently at the tree line about 50 yards away. Following his gaze, I saw lights moving between the trees. Not the steady beam of flashlights, but a soft, pulsing glow that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. "What is that?" Rebecca whispered, emerging from her own tent. The lights danced and flickered, sometimes appearing as individual points and sometimes merging into larger, more diffuse glows. They moved with purpose, circling our position at the edge of the firelight's reach. "Swamp gas," Marcus suggested weakly, though we were nowhere near a swamp. "In the mountains." I shook my head. That's not swamp gas." The lights continued their eerie dance for nearly an hour before gradually fading away. None of us slept after that. Dawn brought little relief. The morning mist clung to the valley floor with unusual persistence, creating a gray, dreamlike atmosphere that made distant objects hard to distinguish. When we finally saw the sun cresting the eastern rim, its light seemed pale and weak. "Maybe we should head back today," Rebecca suggested as we shared a silent breakfast of granola bars and instant coffee. "Come on," Kevin said, though his usual enthusiasm was notably absent. "We came here to get away from civilization, remember? A little wilderness ambiance never hurt anyone." "That wasn't ambiance," I muttered. "That was something else." Marcus stood up and stretched, trying to project normalcy. "Tell you what, why don't we do some exploring today? Get a better sense of the area. If we still feel uncomfortable tonight, we'll pack up tomorrow morning." It was a reasonable compromise, and we were all eager to shake off the oppressive mood of the previous night. We decided to split up and explore different parts of the valley, planning to meet back at camp by mid-afternoon. Rebecca and I headed toward the northern wall of the valley, where we'd spotted what looked like cave openings in the cliff face. Kevin chose to explore the stream, following it toward its source at the eastern end of the valley. Marcus decided to climb partway up the southern slope to get a better view of our surroundings. The caves turned out to be shallow alcoves carved by wind and water over millennia. But as Rebecca and I explored them, we found something that made us both deeply uncomfortable. Bones. They were scattered throughout the deepest alcove, bleached white by years of exposure. Animal bones mostly, but their arrangement seemed deliberate rather than natural. They formed rough circles and spirals, as if they'd been placed there as part of some ritual. "These look old," Rebecca said, crouching to examine a skull that might have belonged to a deer, but not ancient. Maybe a few years at most. I picked up what looked like a human finger bone, then immediately dropped it when I realized what I was holding. "We should get out of here." "Daniel, look at this." Rebecca was standing deeper in the alcove, staring at symbols carved into the rock wall. They weren't Native American petroglyphs. I'd seen plenty of those in museums. These symbols were cruder, more recent, and deeply disturbing. They depicted human figures in various states of consumption, being torn apart, eaten, transformed into something else. "Someone's been using this place," I said, backing toward the cave entrance. "Someone sick." We hurried back toward camp, but when we arrived, we found only Kevin sitting by the cold fire pit. He looked up as we approached, and I immediately noticed something was off about his expression. His usual ready smile was absent, replaced by a blank, almost vacant stare. "Where's Marcus?" Rebecca asked. Kevin blinked slowly as if trying to process the question. "Marcus?" "Yes, Marcus, our friend. He went up the south slope this morning." "Oh." Kevin's voice sounded flat, emotionless. "He hasn't come back yet." "How long have you been here?" I asked, another slow blink. "A while." Rebecca and I exchanged worried glances. This wasn't the Kevin we knew. Where was his constant chatter, his boundless energy? "Kevin, are you feeling all right?" Rebecca asked gently. He turned to look at her, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes looked wrong. Not the color, which was still the familiar brown, but something about the way he was looking at us. It was the stare of a predator studying prey. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice carried an odd echo as if it was coming from somewhere deeper than his throat. A shout from across the valley interrupted my growing unease. We could see Marcus waving his arms on the distant slope, apparently trying to get our attention. He was too far away for us to make out his words, but his body language suggested urgency. "He probably found something interesting," Kevin said, and this time I was certain there was something wrong with his voice. It had a hollow quality, like sound coming through a tunnel. "We should go see what he wants," I said. Kevin stood up with fluid, unnatural grace. "Good idea." As we hiked across the valley floor toward Marcus, I found myself watching Kevin out of the corner of my eye. His movements were too smooth, too coordinated. The Kevin I knew was perpetually clumsy, always tripping over rocks or walking into low branches. This version moved like a dancer, never putting a foot wrong. Marcus met us halfway, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Guys, you need to see this. I found an old mining operation up there. Looks like it's been abandoned for decades. But that's not the weird part." He led us up a steep game trail to a plateau about 200 feet above the valley floor. There, carved into the mountainside, was the entrance to what had once been a mine shaft. Rusted equipment lay scattered around the opening, and the remains of a wooden structure suggested there had once been more substantial operations here. "Check this out," Marcus said, leading us to a flat area near the mine entrance. The ground was covered with a grid of shallow depressions, each about the size of a human body. They were too regular to be natural formations, and too precisely arranged to be coincidental. "Graves," Rebecca suggested. "That's what I thought at first," Marcus said. "But look at this." He knelt beside one of the depressions and brushed away loose dirt and pine needles. Underneath, we could see carved symbols identical to the ones Rebecca and I had found in the cave. "The whole area is covered with these markings," Marcus continued. "Whatever happened here, it involved a lot of people." A sound from the mine shaft behind us made us all turn. It was the same low, moaning sound we'd heard the previous evening, but much closer and more distinct. It echoed from the depths of the mine with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in our bones. "We need to leave," I said immediately. "Now." But as I turned to head back down the trail, I realized Kevin was no longer with us. "Where did Kevin go?" Rebecca asked, voicing my exact thought. We spread out, calling his name, but there was no response. He had simply vanished while we were examining the graves. "He probably went back to camp," Marcus said, though he sounded uncertain. Another moan echoed from the mine, longer and more anguished than before. This time there was something almost human about it, as if someone was in terrible pain deep underground. "Kevin," I called toward the mine entrance. The moaning stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt oppressive. Then, from the darkness beyond the mine entrance came Kevin's voice. "Help me." Without thinking, I started toward the mine shaft, but Rebecca grabbed my arm. "Don't," she whispered urgently. "Something's wrong. Help me. Please," Kevin's voice called again, but now I could hear what Rebecca had noticed. The same hollow, echoing quality that had bothered me earlier, amplified and distorted. "That's not Kevin," Marcus said quietly. As if responding to his words, the voice from the mine began to change. It started as Kevin's familiar tone but gradually shifted, becoming deeper, more guttural, until it no longer sounded human at all. "Hungry," the voice said, drawing out the word until it became a growl. "So hungry." We ran. The trail down from the plateau had never seemed so steep or treacherous. Loose rocks skittered away under our feet, and more than once I nearly lost my balance completely. Behind us, something was moving in the mine shaft. We could hear it scraping against the walls, getting closer to the entrance. By the time we reached the valley floor, we were all gasping for breath. The sun was beginning to set behind the western rim, and long shadows stretched across the grass toward our camp. "We need to pack up and get out of here," Rebecca said between ragged breaths. "What about Kevin?" Marcus asked. "That wasn't Kevin in the mine," I replied. "Kevin's gone." We rushed to break camp, stuffing our belongings into backpacks with desperate efficiency. As darkness fell, we could see lights beginning to dance again in the tree line around the valley, but this time they seemed closer, more aggressive. "There," Marcus said, pointing toward the trail that led back to our car. "We can follow it by moonlight." But as we approached the valley's edge, we found our path blocked. Kevin stood at the mouth of the trail, his back to us, perfectly motionless. "Kevin?" Rebecca called tentatively. He turned around slowly, mechanically, and in the pale moonlight we could see that something was terribly wrong with his face. His features were still recognizably Kevin's, but they seemed somehow loose, as if they weren't quite attached properly. His eyes reflected light like an animal's, and when he smiled, his teeth appeared too sharp, too numerous. "Where are you going?" he asked in that hollow, echoing voice. "The fun is just beginning." "Stay back," I warned, though I had no idea how to defend against whatever Kevin had become. The thing wearing Kevin's face tilted its head at an impossible angle, studying us with predatory interest. "I've been so hungry," it said, "and you brought yourselves right to me." More figures emerged from the tree line around us, shapes that might once have been human but were now twisted into something else entirely. They moved with the same fluid grace we'd noticed in Kevin, surrounding us with calm deliberation. "The mine," one of them said in a voice like grinding stone. "The old mine feeds us, feeds the hunger." "What are you?" Marcus demanded, though his voice shook with terror. The Kevin thing smiled wider, its jaw unhinging like a snake's. "We are what remains when the hunger takes hold." The original miners found something in that mountain, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. They fed it their workers, their families, anyone who came too close, and when they were all consumed, it fed on them too. "But we continue," said another figure, stepping into the moonlight. I recognized the clothes as Kevin's, but the body wearing them was wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in directions human joints weren't meant to allow. "We are the hunger now," the Kevin thing continued. "We sustain ourselves on those who wander into our domain, and you've been so kind to deliver yourselves to us." They began to close in, moving with that terrible fluid grace. I looked around desperately for an escape route, but we were completely surrounded. That's when Marcus did something incredible. Instead of cowering or running, he grabbed a burning branch from our dying campfire and swung it at the nearest figure. The thing recoiled with a shriek that sounded like tearing metal, its form seeming to waver and shift in the firelight. "The fire!" he shouted. "They don't like fire." We grabbed what remained of our campfire, improvising torches from branches and clothing. The creatures fell back, hissing and snarling, their human disguises beginning to slip entirely. In the flickering light, I caught glimpses of what they really were, elongated nightmares of bone and sinew, with too many joints and appendages that weren't quite arms or legs. Fighting our way toward the trail, we managed to break through their circle, but I knew we couldn't outrun them with our makeshift torches, and soon we'd run out of fuel to keep the flames burning. "The mine!" Rebecca gasped as we stumbled up the dark trail. "If that's where it all started, maybe that's where we can end it." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only option we had. We climbed back toward the mining operation, the creatures following at a distance just beyond the reach of our firelight. They were patient now, confident in their eventual victory. At the mine entrance, we could see more of them waiting in the shadows, dozens of twisted forms that had once been human. But we also found something else. Cases of old mining explosives, forgotten and ignored for decades. "Dynamite," Marcus breathed. "If we can collapse the mine..." "It might trap whatever's down there," I finished. We worked frantically to set up the explosives while the creatures circled closer. The Kevin thing stood at the edge of our firelight, its form shifting and changing as we watched. "You cannot destroy the hunger," it said. "The hunger is eternal." "Maybe," Rebecca replied, striking a match to light the fuse, "but we can sure as hell try." The explosion shook the entire mountain. Rock and debris rained down as the mine entrance collapsed in on itself, sealing whatever lay beneath tons of granite and stone. The creatures around us let out collective screams of rage and anguish that echoed across the valley. But instead of being destroyed, they seemed to become more solid, more real. The loss of their underground sanctuary had somehow anchored them to the physical world. "Run," I whispered. We ran through the darkness, guided only by moonlight and the terror that drove us forward. Behind us, the creatures gave chase, no longer bothering with stealth or deception. Their shrieks filled the night air, a symphony of inhuman hunger and rage. The trail seemed endless, winding through trees that grabbed at our clothes and roots that tried to trip us. More than once I felt claws rake across my back as one of the things got too close, but somehow we managed to stay ahead of them. When we finally reached our car, Marcus's hand shook so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine turned over just as the first of the creatures burst from the tree line, and we spun gravel as we accelerated away from that cursed place. We didn't stop driving until we reached the Sacramento city limits, and we didn't speak about what had happened until 3 days later. Even now, 6 months after that night, we rarely discuss it. Marcus moved to Portland. Rebecca changed her phone number and won't tell us her new address. But sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls from a number I don't recognize. When I answer, I hear Kevin's voice, or what used to be Kevin's voice, whispering from some dark place beyond understanding. "I'm still hungry, Daniel," it says, "and I know where you live." I've changed my number twice, but the calls always find me. I've considered moving away, starting over somewhere far from California. But I don't think distance matters to the things we encountered in Desolation Valley. The hunger follows. The hunger remembers. And the hunger is patient. Last week, I found footprints in the mud outside my apartment window. They looked like Kevin's shoes, but they were far too deep, as if whatever made them weighed much more than any human should. And yesterday, my neighbor mentioned seeing a man standing in the parking lot all night, staring up at my building. "Tall, thin guy," she said. "Didn't move for hours, just watched." There was something really unsettling about the way he stood. Too still, you know? Like he wasn't really breathing. I'm writing this account because I don't think I have much time left. The hunger is coming for me, and when it does, I'll become just another voice calling from the darkness, luring new victims into its ancient trap. If you're reading this, stay away from Desolation Valley. Don't trust the maps or the trail markers. Don't camp alone in the wilderness. And if you're hiking with friends and one of them goes missing, only to return acting strange. If they move too smoothly, speak too hollowly, or stare too intently, don't trust them. Run. Run as far and as fast as you can. The hunger is always waiting, and it's always patient. And once it has your scent, it will never stop following. The phone is ringing again. I can see Kevin's name on the caller ID, though I know Kevin died in that mine 6 months ago. The voice on the other end will be hollow and echoing, promising terrible things in words that sound almost human. I'm not going to answer this time. Instead, I'm going to drive. Maybe I can outrun it after all. But I don't think so. In the reflection of my dark window, I can see something standing in the parking lot below, perfectly still, staring up at my apartment. It looks like Kevin, but Kevin is gone. The hunger remains. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Angeles National Forest, specifically in the remote wilderness area near Mount Baldy, California. I'm writing this with my left hand because my right arm is still in a cast, and the doctors say I'm lucky to be alive. But luck had nothing to do with what happened up there. Some things in this world are older and hungrier than we can imagine. It was supposed to be a team-building weekend. Our software company, TechFlow Solutions, had been hemorrhaging employees after a brutal quarter, and our manager Janet thought a camping trip would boost morale. "Nothing brings people together like surviving in the wilderness," she'd said with that forced enthusiasm that made us all exchange glances. 4 of us volunteered, or were voluntarily voluntold. Myself, Janet Reed, Kevin King from accounting, and Sarah Rodriguez from QA. We'd all worked together for 2 years but had never spent time outside the fluorescent-lit office environment. Janet had insisted on the most remote location possible. "No cell service, no distractions, just pure nature," she declared while spreading a topographical map across the conference table. Her finger traced a route deep into the San Gabriel Mountains to a spot called Stoddard Canyon that was at least 15 miles from the nearest road. Kevin, who looked like he'd never seen a tree outside of a screensaver, suggested somewhere closer to civilization. But Janet was adamant. We're going to disconnect completely, reset our minds, come back refreshed and unified as a team. I should have listened to the ice-cold feeling that slithered down my spine when she said that. We drove up Highway 39 on a Friday afternoon in October, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes you forget California has seasons. Janet had rented a massive SUV that could handle the fire roads, and we loaded it with enough gear for a week, though we were only staying 2 nights. The conversation was awkward at first, office small talk transitioning poorly to personal revelation, but as we climbed into the mountains, something loosened between us. Sarah told us about her divorce finalizing the month before. Kevin admitted he'd been seeing a therapist for anxiety. I found myself talking about my dad's death the previous year, how I'd been sleepwalking through life since then. Even Janet, usually our buttoned-up corporate cheerleader, mentioned feeling burned out and wondering if she was in the right career. By the time we turned onto the Forest Service road, we actually felt like friends. The GPS died first. "That's weird," Janet said, tapping the screen as we bounced along the increasingly rough road. "It was working fine a minute ago." The device showed our blue dot hovering in a gray void, no roads or landmarks visible. Kevin tried his phone. No signal, which we'd expected, but the GPS app wouldn't even load the cached maps. "No worries," I said, pulling out the paper map Janet had marked. "We're old school now." But when I spread the map across my lap, the marked route didn't make sense. The fire road we were on wasn't shown, and the canyon Janet had circled seemed to be in a completely different location than where we were heading. "Must be an old map," Sarah said from the passenger seat, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. We drove another hour, the road becoming little more than 2 tire tracks separated by a ridge of dead grass. The sun was getting low, painting the canyon walls the color of dried blood. Finally, Janet pulled into a small clearing surrounded by Jeffrey pines and declared we'd found our campsite. The silence hit us immediately after she cut the engine. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but something deeper, oppressive. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the air itself was holding its breath. "Wow," Kevin said, climbing out and stretching. "It's really quiet." We set up camp with practiced efficiency. Janet had made us all watch YouTube tutorials beforehand. 2 dome tents, a camp kitchen area, and a fire pit ringed with stones. The physical activity felt good after the long drive, and our spirits lifted as the camp took shape. But the silence never broke. I kept expecting to hear birds, or the rustle of small animals, or the buzz of insects. Instead, there was only our voices and the occasional distant groan of settling trees. Even our own sounds seemed swallowed too quickly, as if the forest was absorbing them. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" Sarah asked as we gathered around the unlit fire pit. "It's probably just the altitude," Janet said, though she was unconsciously speaking in a lower voice. Thin air affects sound. I wanted to point out that we were only at about 5,000 feet. Hardly thin air territory, but something made me keep quiet. Maybe it was the way the shadows between the trees seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Kevin got the fire started as the sun disappeared behind the western ridge. The flames provided warmth and a bubble of orange light that pushed back the gathering darkness, but somehow made everything beyond its reach seem even blacker. We heated up beef stew and passed around a bottle of whiskey Janet had smuggled in. "This is actually nice," Sarah said, and for a moment it was. The alcohol relaxed us. The fire crackled cheerfully and the stars began appearing in a sky clearer than any of us had seen in years. Then Kevin started telling ghost stories. "My grandfather used to hunt in these mountains," he said, his face flickering in the firelight. "He told me about the old Tongva legends, about spirits that could wear the faces of the dead." "Kevin," Janet warned, but he continued. "They called them skinwalkers, things that weren't quite human, that would mimic people to lure victims away from safety." Sarah laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's just folklore. Every culture has shapeshifter myths. Maybe, Kevin said, taking another pull from the whiskey bottle. But my grandfather swore he saw one once, up near Mount Baldy. Said it looked exactly like his dead brother. Even knew things only his brother would know. But the eyes were wrong. Too bright. And it didn't blink enough. I felt that ice-cold sensation again, stronger this time. How about we talk about something else? But Kevin was warming to his subject, emboldened by the alcohol. The Tongva said skinwalkers were people who'd performed forbidden rituals, traded their humanity for power. They could take the shape of animals or recently dead humans, but something always gave them away. A missing shadow, or walking backwards, or... A branch snapped in the darkness beyond our camp. We all froze, eyes straining to peer past the firelight. The snap had been loud, deliberate, like something large stepping on dead wood. "Probably just a deer," Janet whispered. Another snap from a different direction. Then the soft whisper of something moving through dry leaves. "Should we?" Sarah started to say, but I held up a hand for quiet. We sat in complete silence for several minutes, listening. Finally, the sounds faded away, and we convinced ourselves it had been wildlife checking out our camp. "See?" Janet said, forcing a laugh. "Just Bambi investigating the newcomers." But when I went to take a leak before bed, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the soft dirt around our campsite, there were tracks. Barefoot human tracks, too large to belong to any of us, circling our tents again and again like something had been pacing around us while we sat by the fire. I didn't tell the others. Sleep came hard that night. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The zip of tent fabric, the whisper of sleeping bags, the occasional pop from the dying embers. But worse were the periods of absolute silence, when even the wind died and the world felt like it was holding its breath. I must have dozed off because I woke to Sarah screaming. Janet and I burst out of our tent simultaneously. Sarah was standing outside hers in her pajamas, shaking and pointing into the darkness. "Someone was watching me sleep," she gasped, standing right outside my tent. I could see the silhouette through the fabric. Kevin emerged from his tent, groggy and confused. "What's happening?" "Sarah saw someone," Janet said, grabbing a flashlight and sweeping it across the perimeter of our camp. The beam revealed nothing but trees and shadows. No footprints in the areas where the ground was soft enough to show them. "I know what I saw," Sarah insisted. "Someone was standing right there, not moving, just watching." We stayed up the rest of the night, taking turns keeping watch. When dawn finally broke, we found Sarah's tent staked down exactly as it should be, with no signs of disturbance. But 20 feet away, carved into the bark of a massive pine, was a symbol none of us recognized. Spiraling lines that seemed to shift when you looked at them directly. "Probably just old hiking graffiti," Janet said, but she was already talking about cutting the trip short. "One more night," Kevin pleaded. "We drove all this way, and it's probably just our imaginations running wild because of my stupid ghost stories." Sarah was reluctant, but I found myself agreeing with Kevin. Not because I wanted to stay. Every instinct was screaming at me to pack up and leave, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wouldn't just let us go, that running might trigger something worse. "Fine," Janet decided, "but no more ghost stories and we stick together today. No wandering off alone." We spent the morning hiking as a group, exploring a narrow canyon that wound deeper into the mountains. The oppressive silence continued, broken only by our own voices and footsteps. Even the stream that should have been babbling through the canyon bottom was silent, its water moving without a sound. It was Kevin who noticed the trees first. "Do these look wrong to anyone else?" he asked, stopping in front of a grove of oaks. I studied them and felt my skin crawl. The trees were healthy and full-leafed, but something was off about their arrangement. They formed a perfect circle with each trunk exactly the same distance from its neighbors. In the center of the circle was a patch of ground where nothing grew, not even grass. "Trees don't naturally grow in patterns like that," Sarah murmured. Janet was consulting her map again, frowning. This grove isn't marked. Neither is this canyon, actually. According to this, we should be hiking through open meadow. I looked back the way we'd come. The canyon mouth was no longer visible behind us, though we'd only been walking for an hour. Instead, the walls seemed to have closed in, creating a narrow corridor with no obvious exit. We should head back, I said. But when we turned around, the path we'd taken was gone. Where there should have been a clear trail leading back toward camp was a solid wall of stone, as if the canyon had sealed itself behind us. That's impossible, Janet breathed. Kevin was hyperventilating. How is that impossible? We just walked through there. I was fighting my own panic, the claustrophobic weight of stone walls pressing in on us, but I forced myself to think clearly. There has to be another way out. Canyons don't just seal up. We spent the next 3 hours searching every inch of the canyon walls, finding nothing but sheer rock faces and dense thickets of thorny brush. The sun moved overhead, but the shadows in the canyon seemed to grow deeper rather than shifting with the light. It was Sarah who found the tunnel. "Over here," she called from behind a massive boulder. "There's an opening." The hole in the rock face was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. When I shined my flashlight inside, the beam disappeared into darkness deeper than should have been possible. "We are not going in there," Janet said flatly. "It might be our only way out," Kevin argued. "Or it might lead to a dead end, or a cave-in, or—" A sound echoed from the tunnel, soft and rhythmic, like footsteps approaching from very far away. We backed away from the opening, clustering together in the center of the canyon. The footsteps continued, growing gradually louder but never seeming to get closer. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered. Before anyone could answer, Kevin let out a strangled gasp. He was staring up at the canyon rim, where a figure stood silhouetted against the sky. It looked like a person, but something about its proportions was wrong. Too tall, with arms that hung too low. Even from this distance, I could see that it was watching us. "Hey!" Janet shouted up at it. "Can you help us? We're lost." The figure tilted its head at an impossible angle, like a bird studying an insect. Then it smiled. Even from 100 feet away, that smile was clearly visible, too wide and with too many teeth. It stepped backward and vanished. "We're leaving," I said, "right now, whatever it takes." The tunnel was our only option. I went first, squeezing through the narrow opening with my flashlight gripped in my teeth. The passage was tight enough that my shoulders scraped the walls, and the rock felt wrong under my hands. Too smooth, too warm, like skin rather than stone. The tunnel opened into a larger space after about 20 feet. I waited for the others to emerge before shining my light around. We were in a natural cavern, with passages leading off in 3 directions. The footsteps we'd heard had stopped. "Which way?" Kevin asked. Before I could answer, we heard Janet scream from behind us. She was still in the tunnel, and something was wrong with her voice. It sounded like Janet, but the pitch was off, and it went on too long, as if she'd forgotten how screaming was supposed to work. "Janet!" Sarah called into the tunnel. "Help me," came Janet's voice from the darkness. "Something has me. I can't move." Kevin started toward the tunnel, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait! Michael, she needs help." "That's not Janet," I said, my blood turning to ice water. Sarah stared at me. "What do you mean that's not?" "Help me," the voice called again, and this time I could hear it clearly. The voice was Janet's, but the cadence was wrong. Too measured, like something trying to remember how human speech worked. "Janet," I called into the tunnel. "What's your daughter's name?" Silence. Janet didn't have a daughter, but if something was mimicking her, it wouldn't know that. "Help me," the voice repeated exactly the same as before. Not an answer, just a playback. "Where's Janet?" Sarah whispered. I couldn't answer because I was afraid I already knew. We backed away from the tunnel entrance, moving deeper into the cavern system. The passages ahead were lit by some kind of bioluminescence, a sickly green glow that emanated from the walls themselves. Our footsteps echoed strangely, multiplying and overlapping until it sounded like an army marching behind us. The passage we chose opened into a vast underground chamber, and that's where we found Janet. She was sitting with her back against the far wall, completely motionless. Her eyes were open and reflecting our flashlight beams like an animal's. As we approached, she turned her head toward us with a movement too fluid and fast. "There you are," she said in her normal voice. "I've been waiting." But her smile was the same too wide grin we'd seen on the figure above the canyon. "Janet?" Kevin took a step toward her. "Don't," I warned, but he was already moving. "Janet, what happened? How did you get down here?" She stood up, and something was wrong with the way she moved. Her joints bent at angles that weren't quite right, and her feet didn't seem to be touching the ground properly. "I found a shortcut," she said, still smiling that horrible smile. "Would you like me to show you?" Her head tilted to the side, too far, like an owl's. In the flashlight beam, I could see that her eyes weren't reflecting the light. They were generating it, glowing with their own pale luminescence. Kevin screamed and stumbled backward. The thing wearing Janet's face laughed, a sound like wind through broken glass. "Kevin doesn't like my new look," it said, "but don't worry, you'll all get to wear new faces soon." That's when it lunged. The creature moved with inhuman speed, covering the 20 feet between us in a single bound. Kevin went down with a wet, gurgling sound. The thing's fingers, now too long and ending in claws, buried in his throat. Sarah and I ran. The cavern system was a maze of interconnected chambers and passages. We stumbled through them blindly, our flashlight beams carving wild arcs through the darkness. Behind us, I could hear the creature that had been Janet making sounds no human throat could produce. Clicks and hisses and something like laughter. "This way," Sarah gasped, pulling me toward a passage that angled upward. We climbed for what felt like hours, our lungs burning in the thin air. The sounds of pursuit faded behind us, but somehow that was worse than hearing them. At least when we could hear the creature, we knew where it was. The passage finally opened onto a ledge on the canyon wall, about halfway up from where we'd entered the tunnel. The moon had risen while we were underground, painting the landscape in silver and black. "We have to get back to camp," I said. "Get the car keys and get out of here." Sarah nodded, but when I looked at her face in the moonlight, I felt that familiar chill of wrongness. "Sarah," I said carefully, "tell me about your divorce." She smiled, the same too wide smile. "What divorce, Michael?" Earlier, she'd told us about her divorce finalizing, but this thing wearing her face didn't remember. I ran. Behind me, the Sarah thing let out a shriek that echoed off the canyon walls. I scrambled down the rocky slope, cutting my hands on sharp stones, not caring about anything except getting away. The campsite was exactly as we'd left it. Our tents standing in a neat row, the cold ashes of our fire in the ring of stones. I grabbed the car keys from Janet's pack and was turning toward the SUV when I heard footsteps behind me. "Michael." I spun around. Kevin stood at the edge of the firelight, his hiking clothes torn and bloody. The wounds on his throat were visible but not bleeding. "Kevin? Jesus, I thought you were dead." He smiled, too wide. "I am." I ran for the SUV, but my legs felt like lead. Behind me, Kevin laughed with that broken glass sound. I reached the vehicle and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. The engine turned over just as Kevin reached the driver's side door. He pressed his face against the window, his skin pale and wrong in the dashboard light. "Where are you going, Michael? Don't you want to stay and play?" I threw the SUV in reverse and floored it, spinning gravel. In the rearview mirror, I saw Kevin standing motionless in the headlight beams, watching me go. The fire road seemed different now, longer and more winding than before. My GPS was still dead, but I followed the tire tracks we'd made coming in. Every shadow looked like it might hide something watching, and twice I could have sworn I saw figures pacing alongside the SUV just beyond the reach of the headlights. It took 3 hours to reach the paved road, and another 2 to get to the sheriff's station in Azusa. I tried to explain what had happened, but how do you tell someone that your co-workers were killed and replaced by something that shouldn't exist? They organized a search and rescue operation at dawn. 2 days later, they found our campsite, exactly as I'd described it. But they never found Kevin, Janet, or Sarah. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or animal attack. But I know better, because 3 weeks later, Kevin showed up at our office. He looked exactly like himself, acted exactly like himself, knew everything Kevin had known. He had a story about getting separated from the group, wandering lost for days before finding a road. He was treated like a hero, a survivor. But his eyes were too bright, and he didn't blink enough, and sometimes when he thought no one was looking, he would smile that too wide smile. I quit my job the next day and moved to a different city. I changed my name and told no one where I was going. But sometimes, in crowded places, I'll catch a glimpse of a familiar face. Janet buying coffee at the shop across from my apartment. Sarah getting on the bus I just got off. They're still looking for me. The thing about skinwalkers, I learned from researching the old Tongva legends, is that they're never satisfied with just one skin. They collect them, add them to their repertoire, and once they've worn your face, they know everything you know, everyone you care about. I don't sleep well anymore. Every reflection might be wrong, every familiar face might be a trap. The doctor says my paranoia is a trauma response, treatable with therapy and medication. But paranoia assumes the threats aren't real. Last week, I got a Christmas card from my mother. She's been dead for 5 years. The return address was a campground in the Angeles National Forest. I'm writing this as a warning. If you ever go camping in remote areas, and you notice the silence is too deep, the shadows too dark, if your maps stop making sense or your friends start acting wrong, leave immediately. Don't wait for explanations. Don't try to help them. And whatever you do, don't let them see your face clearly. Because once something like that sees you, really sees you, it never forgets. They're patient, these creatures. They can wait decades for the right moment. But they always collect what they're owed. I can hear footsteps outside my apartment now. Slow, deliberate steps that stop right outside my door. 3 sets, keeping perfect time with each other. I'm not going to look through the peephole. I already know what I'll see. My name is Michael Williams and I am 28 years old. This happened in the ancient bristlecone pine forest, high in the White Mountains of Eastern California, during what should have been a simple 3-day hiking trip with my best friend Jake. The plan was straightforward enough. Jake Morrison and I had been talking about this trip for months, ever since his divorce finalized and he needed to get away from everything. The ancient bristlecone pine forest seemed perfect, remote, challenging, and home to some of the oldest living things on Earth. Trees that had been growing for over 4,000 years, Jake had read aloud from his guidebook, his voice filled with the kind of wonder I hadn't heard from him in over a year. We drove up from Los Angeles on a Thursday morning in early October, my Jeep loaded with enough gear for a week, even though we'd only planned to stay 3 days. Jake insisted on overpacking, sleeping bags rated for 20 below, enough MREs to feed a small army, 2 different water filtration systems. Better safe than sorry, he kept saying, and I didn't argue. The man had been through hell with the divorce, losing his house, his dog, even his fishing tackle that his ex-wife sold out of spite. If bringing extra gear made him feel better, so be it. The drive up Highway 395 took us through Bishop and then up the winding mountain road toward the forest. The landscape changed gradually from high desert to alpine, the air growing thinner and colder with each switchback. Jake sat in the passenger seat staring out at the vast emptiness of the Owens Valley spread below us, his fingers drumming nervously against his knee. "You know what I love about places like this?" he said as we climbed higher into the White Mountains. No cell towers, no internet, No lawyers calling every 5 minutes about asset division. He held up his phone, showing me the no service message. It's like the modern world just stops existing. I should have paid more attention to the edge in his voice when he said that. We reached the Shulman Grove Visitor Center just as it was closing, the Lone Ranger looking relieved to see us pull up. He was a weathered man in his 60s, with the kind of deep tan that comes from decades of high-altitude sun. "You boys planning to camp up here?" he asked, looking at our packs. 3 days, I told him. We've got permits for the backcountry areas. He nodded, but I caught him glancing at the sky. The afternoon was clear, but there was something in the air, a pressure change that made my ears pop. "Weather's supposed to turn," he said. "Nothing too serious, but you might want to keep an eye on it and stick to the marked trails." He paused, studying us with the intensity of someone who'd seen too many rescue operations. "Some folks went missing up here last month. Experienced hikers, too. Park Service is still looking." Jake and I exchanged glances. "Missing how?" Jake asked. "That's the thing," the ranger said, lowering his voice. "They found their campsite intact. Food still in the bear canisters, sleeping bags laid out, fire ring prepared but never lit. Like they just walked away from everything." The ranger's words followed us as we hiked the Discovery Trail to get our bearings. The ancient bristlecone pines loomed around us, their gnarled, twisted forms looking more like sculptures than living trees. Some of them had been growing since before the pyramids were built, their wood so dense and resinous that even dead branches could last for millennia. Walking among them felt like moving through a graveyard of giants. "These trees make me feel insignificant," Jake said, running his hand along the smooth bark of a particularly ancient specimen. 4,000 years. Think about all the things they've seen. I was about to respond when I heard it. A sound like footsteps echoing our own, but just slightly off rhythm. I stopped walking and held up my hand. Jake froze beside me. We listened for 30 seconds. Nothing but wind through the branches and the distant cry of a hawk. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" "Footsteps. Like someone was following us." Jake shook his head. "Just the echo of our own steps. Probably. These mountains play tricks with sound." But I could have sworn the footsteps had continued for a beat or two after we stopped. We made camp that first night in a small clearing about 2 miles from the main trail, surrounded by a grove of living bristlecones. Jake was in better spirits than I'd seen him in months, setting up his tent with military precision and even attempting to tell a few jokes while we prepared dinner over my portable stove. "You know what the best thing about camping is?" he said, stirring a packet of beef stroganoff into boiling water. "No one can serve you divorce papers out here." I laughed, but something about the way he said it made me look at him more closely. There was a brittleness to his humor, like glass under pressure. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped faster than I'd expected. We built a fire in the designated ring, feeding it with dead wood we'd collected during our hike. The flames cast dancing shadows on the ancient trees around us, making their twisted forms look even more otherworldly. That's when Jake started acting strange. It began with small things. He kept looking over his shoulder, peering into the darkness beyond our fire's light. When I asked him what was wrong, he just shook his head and said he thought he'd heard something. But when I listened, all I could hear was the wind and the occasional pop of our fire. "It's probably just being in a new place," he said, but his hand kept drifting to the hunting knife on his belt. "Everything sounds different when you're not used to it." Around 10 o'clock, Jake announced he was going to gather more firewood. "Fire's getting low," he said, standing up and grabbing his flashlight. "Don't want it to die completely." "I'll come with you," I offered, but he waved me off. "Nah, there's plenty of deadfall just outside the clearing. I'll be back in 5 minutes." That was the last time I saw the real Jake. He was gone for 45 minutes. I called his name every few minutes, my voice echoing strangely in the thin mountain air. I was about to grab my own flashlight and go looking for him when I heard his voice calling back from the darkness. "Michael, I'm coming back. Sorry, got turned around for a minute." Relief flooded through me as I saw his flashlight beam bobbing through the trees. Jake emerged from the darkness carrying an armload of deadwood, smiling apologetically. "Sorry about that. Found this great fallen tree about 100 yards out, but then I got confused about which direction I'd come from. These trees all look the same in the dark." I helped him stack the wood by our fire ring, but something felt off. Jake seemed subdued. During the day, he'd been animated, pointing out interesting rock formations and wildlife. Now, he sat quietly on his camping chair, staring into the fire with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You okay, man?" I asked. He looked at me then, and for just a moment, I could have sworn his eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. But when I blinked, they looked normal again. "Yeah, just tired. It's been a long day." But he didn't seem tired. He seemed alert in a way that was almost predatory, like he was listening for something I couldn't hear. We sat in silence for another hour before turning in. As I zipped up my sleeping bag, I heard Jake moving around in his tent, but the sounds were wrong somehow. Instead of the normal rustling of someone getting comfortable, there were strange, deliberate movements, like he was rearranging something over and over again. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to complete silence. No wind, no insects, no sounds of Jake moving in his tent. The silence was so absolute it felt like a physical presence, pressing down on my eardrums. I lay there for what felt like hours, straining to hear something, anything, that would break the oppressive quiet. When I finally drifted back to sleep, I dreamed of footsteps circling our camp just beyond the dying light of our fire. Morning came gray and cold, with a thin mist hanging between the trees. I unzipped my sleeping bag and immediately noticed that our fire had burned down to nothing but cold ash. That was wrong. We'd built it up high before going to bed, and Jake had specifically said he wanted to keep it going through the night. "Jake?" I called out. "You awake?" No response from his tent. I dressed quickly and walked over to check on him. His tent was zipped shut from the inside, but when I called his name again, there was only silence. "Jake, we need to get moving if we want to make it to the research station today." Still nothing. A cold knot of worry formed in my stomach. I reached out and shook the side of his tent. "Jake!" The tent moved too easily, like it was empty. I found the zipper and pulled it down, expecting to find Jake still asleep in his bag. The tent was empty. His sleeping bag was laid out normally, but it was cold to the touch. Jake was nowhere to be seen. I spent the next hour searching the area around our camp, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away from the tent, no indication of where he might have gone. His boots were still lined up neatly outside his tent. His pack was still where he'd left it the night before. It was as if he'd simply vanished from inside his zipped sleeping bag. I was about to head back toward the main trail to find help when I heard his voice calling from somewhere in the forest. "Michael, over here!" The voice came from the direction opposite the main trail, deeper into the wilderness area where the bristlecone groves gave way to scattered patches of pine and granite outcroppings. "Jake, where the hell are you?" "I'm okay, just got a little lost. Can you come help me? I think I hurt my ankle." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anger. What the hell was he doing wandering around in the woods at night without his boots? But the relief outweighed everything else. I grabbed my pack and headed toward the sound of his voice. I found him about a quarter mile from our camp, sitting on a fallen log with his right foot elevated. He was wearing his hiking boots, which was impossible, since I'd just seen them by his tent, but I was too relieved to think clearly about the inconsistency. "Jesus, Jake, you scared the hell out of me. What were you doing out here?" He looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Couldn't sleep. Decided to do a little night hiking, but I stepped wrong and rolled my ankle pretty good." Something about his voice was off. The cadence was right. The tone was familiar, but there was an underlying quality that made my skin crawl. Like someone doing an impression of Jake without quite getting it right. "Let me take a look," I said, kneeling down beside him. "No, it's fine. Just twisted. Give me a hand up and I can walk on it." I helped him to his feet, and he put his arm around my shoulders for support. As we walked back toward camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. Jake felt heavier than he should have, and his arm around my shoulders was too cold, even for the morning chill. "How did you get out of your tent without unzipping it?" I asked. He was quiet for so long, I thought he hadn't heard me. Then he said, "What do you mean?" "Your tent was zipped shut from the inside when I found it empty." Another long pause. I must have zipped it back up from outside. Habit, I guess. But that was impossible. The zipper was a two-way system, and it had definitely been closed from the inside. I'd had to pull the internal zipper to open it. When we got back to camp, Jake immediately went to his tent and started packing his gear. His movements were efficient but mechanical, like he was following a checklist rather than working from familiarity. "We should head back," he said without looking at me. "My ankle's worse than I thought." "Are you sure? We just got here, and yesterday you were so excited about seeing the Methuselah Grove." He stopped packing and turned to look at me. For just a moment his face was completely blank, like he didn't understand what I was talking about. Then he smiled. But it was wrong. Too wide, showing too many teeth. "Right, the Methuselah Grove. Of course I want to see that." But his voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script. We broke camp quickly and started hiking toward the research station where we'd planned to spend our second night. Jake insisted he could walk, but his gait was awkward, and he kept stumbling over roots and rocks that he should have easily avoided. The man I'd hiked with for years was sure-footed as a mountain goat. This person moved like he was wearing someone else's body. The trail wound through increasingly sparse vegetation as we climbed higher into the alpine zone. The air was thin enough to make my lungs burn, but Jake didn't seem affected at all. If anything, he seemed to be getting stronger as we climbed. We stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook with a view across the Owens Valley to the Sierra Nevada. Jake sat on a granite boulder and unpacked his lunch, but instead of eating, he just stared at the food like he'd never seen it before. "You need to eat something," I said. "Keep your energy up." He looked at me with those two bright eyes. "Of course. Food. Yes." He took a bite of his energy bar, chewed mechanically and swallowed, but I could have sworn I saw him grimace slightly, like the taste was wrong somehow. "Jake, are you feeling okay? You've been acting strange since this morning." "Strange how?" "I don't know. Different, like you're not quite yourself." He tilted his head, studying me with an intensity that made me deeply uncomfortable. Who else would I be? There was something in the way he asked the question that made my blood run cold. Not, "What else would I be?" or "What do you mean?" but "Who else would I be?" Like he was genuinely curious about the answer. We hiked in silence for the rest of the afternoon. The landscape grew increasingly desolate as we moved away from the main groves. Here, the ancient trees were scattered and wind-sculpted into fantastic shapes, some barely alive, others long dead but still standing like monuments to endurance. Jake kept looking around with an expression of fascination, like he was seeing everything for the first time. When we passed a particularly grotesque specimen, a tree that looked like it was screaming, he stopped and stared at it for a long time. "Beautiful," he said softly. "Beautiful?" The tree looked like something out of a nightmare. "It looks like it's in agony." He turned to me with that unsettling smile. "Yes, that's what makes it beautiful." We reached the research station just as the sun was setting behind the Sierra crest. The station was little more than a weather-beaten cabin with solar panels and a radio antenna, but it represented civilization in this vast wilderness. I felt a surge of relief as we approached the building. Jake had other ideas. "Let's camp outside," he said, stopping about 50 yards from the cabin. "I don't like enclosed spaces." That was a lie. Jake loved enclosed spaces. He'd spent most of our previous camping trips complaining about sleeping in tents instead of cabins. But I was too tired to argue, and something about his tone discouraged disagreement. We set up our tents in a small clearing with the research station in sight. Jake moved through the familiar motions of making camp, but everything was slightly wrong. He set up his tent backwards with the door facing the wrong direction. He arranged his gear in patterns that made no sense. When I pointed out the tent issue, he stared at it for a long moment, then started over without explanation. As darkness fell, I tried to start a fire, but the matches wouldn't light. They'd strike and flare briefly, then die as if the air was too thin to sustain flame. After the fifth failed attempt, Jake took the matches from me. "Let me try." He struck a match and it burst into a flame that was too bright, too blue. The fire he built burned with colors I'd never seen in a campfire, deep purples and greens that hurt to look at directly. "How did you do that?" I asked. "Do what?" "The fire, those colors." He looked at the flames dancing in the ring, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw something move behind his eyes. Something that wasn't Jake. "I don't see any colors," he said. "It looks normal to me." But the fire was definitely wrong. It gave off light but no warmth, and the smoke smelled like burning metal instead of wood. I wanted to put it out and start over, but every time I moved toward the fire ring, Jake would shift position to block me. We ate dinner in silence, Jake mechanically consuming his food while staring into the strange flames. Every now and then, he would tilt his head like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Jake, I think we should hike out tomorrow morning." "Why?" "Something's not right. You've been acting strange, the fire is wrong, and I keep feeling like we're being watched." He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to respond. Then he smiled, that too wide smile. "You're being paranoid, Michael. Everything is fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing was fine. The Jake sitting across from me might look like my friend, might sound like him, but everything from his posture to his speech patterns was wrong. It was like watching someone wear Jake's face like a mask. I excused myself and went to my tent, claiming fatigue. In reality, I needed time to think, to figure out what was happening. I lay in my sleeping bag with my knife within easy reach, listening to Jake move around the campfire outside. But the sounds weren't right either. Instead of the normal human sounds of someone settling in for the night, there were strange shuffling noises like he was rearranging himself into an uncomfortable position. Around midnight, the sounds stopped. I lay there in the absolute silence, straining to hear any indication that Jake was still outside. After what felt like hours, I heard his tent zipper open and close, then nothing. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, someone was calling my name from outside my tent. "Michael, wake up." It was Jake's voice, but it was coming from the wrong direction. His tent was to my left, but the voice was coming from my right, from the direction of the research station. "Michael, you need to see this." I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent. The campfire had died to embers, casting everything in a dim red glow. Jake's tent was dark and silent. "Jake, where are you?" "Over here, by the station. Something's wrong with the radio." I could see a figure standing near the research station, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. It was definitely human-shaped, definitely the right size to be Jake, but something about its posture was off. "What's wrong with the radio?" "It's picking up something strange. Voices, but they're not speaking English." Against my better judgment, I walked toward the figure. As I got closer, I could see it was wearing Jake's clothes, had Jake's build, even had Jake's distinctive way of standing with one shoulder slightly raised. But when it turned to face me, the face I saw in my flashlight beam was wrong. It was Jake's face, but it was like looking at a photograph that had been slightly distorted. The proportions were off by just enough to trigger a deep, instinctive revulsion. The eyes were too close together, the mouth was too wide, and the skin had a waxy quality that reminded me of a badly made mannequin. "Do you hear it?" the thing wearing Jake's face asked. "The voices?" I could hear something coming from inside the research station, a low, rhythmic chanting in a language I didn't recognize. But I was more concerned with the fact that whatever was standing in front of me was not my friend. "You're not Jake," I said, backing away slowly. It tilted its head, studying me with those wrong eyes. Of course I'm Jake. Who else would I be? That was the same question it had asked at lunch, phrased exactly the same way, like a recording being played back. Where is he? Where's the real Jake? The thing smiled, and its mouth opened wider than any human mouth should be able to open. Jake is safe. Jake is sleeping. Jake is dreaming such beautiful dreams. I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear laughter that started as Jake's familiar chuckle but quickly devolved into something inhuman, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the scream of a hunting cat. I sprinted through the darkness, using my flashlight to navigate between the twisted shapes of the ancient trees, my only thought to get as far away from that thing as possible. I ran for what felt like hours, stumbling over rocks and roots, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I was completely lost. The research station was nowhere to be seen, and my flashlight beam revealed nothing but an endless forest of nightmare trees stretching in every direction. That's when I heard Jake's voice calling my name. Not the voice of the thing that had been wearing his face, but Jake's real voice, weak and distant, coming from somewhere in the darkness ahead of me. Michael, help me. I followed the voice deeper into the forest, my flashlight beam dancing across increasingly bizarre tree formations. Some of the bristle cones here looked like they'd grown into impossible shapes, spirals and knots that defied physics. Others seemed to be moving slightly, their branches swaying in patterns that didn't match the wind. Michael, please. The voice was getting closer. I pushed through a dense patch of low-growing trees and found myself in a small clearing dominated by a single massive bristlecone pine. The tree was easily the largest I'd seen, its trunk thick enough to hide a car behind, but what made me stop in horror was what was growing from the tree. About 8 feet up the trunk, Jake's face was emerging from the bark like it was breaking through the surface of dark water. His eyes were open and aware, but his mouth was sealed shut by woody growth. The expression on his face was one of absolute terror. Jake! I scrambled up the twisted trunk trying to reach him, but the bark felt wrong under my hands, not rough like wood should be, but soft and warm like skin. As I climbed higher, I could see that the tree hadn't just captured Jake, it was consuming him. His body was partially merged with the trunk, his arms and legs disappearing into the wood grain like they were sinking into quicksand. His eyes tracked my movement, and I could see him trying to speak, but the bark had grown over his mouth like a living gag. When I reached him, I pulled out my knife and started cutting at the woody growth around his face. The tree screamed. It was a sound like nothing I'd ever heard, the shriek of tearing wood mixed with something that was definitely organic, definitely in pain. The entire trunk shuddered and I felt Jake being pulled deeper into the wood. "Hold on," I shouted, sawing at the bark with my knife. Black sap oozed from the cuts, thick and viscous like blood. "I'm going to get you out of here." But even as I cut, more bark was growing to replace what I removed. It was like trying to dig a hole in water. For every inch I freed, 2 more inches of woody growth would surge up to cover Jake's face. That's when I heard my own voice calling from the darkness beyond the clearing. "Jake, where are you? I've been looking everywhere." I stopped cutting and looked toward the sound. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a perfect replica of myself. It was wearing my clothes, carrying my pack, even had the small scar on my left hand from a childhood accident. But its eyes held the same predatory intelligence I'd seen in the thing wearing Jake's face. "There you are," the thing said in my voice. I was so worried. "What are you doing to that tree?" I realized then what was happening. Whatever these things were, they were collectors. They took people, trapped them in the trees, and then used their forms to lure in others. Jake had been taken first, probably during his nighttime wood-gathering expedition. The thing that had come back to camp wasn't Jake at all. It was one of these creatures, learning to mimic him, practicing being human. And now it was doing the same with me. "You're not fooling anyone," I said, keeping my knife ready. The Michael thing tilted its head in that same unsettling way the Jake thing had done. I don't know what you mean. I'm you, Michael. I'm here to help. If you're me, then what's my middle name? It paused, and for just a moment its face went completely blank. Then it smiled with too many teeth. Does it matter? Soon we'll be the same person anyway. More shapes emerged from the darkness around the clearing. Dozens of them, all wearing familiar faces. I saw the missing hikers the ranger had mentioned, a man and woman in their 30s, still wearing their REI gear but with that same predatory gleam in their eyes. Behind them came others, people I didn't recognize but who moved with that same wrong gait I'd noticed in the fake Jake. They formed a loose circle around the tree and I realized I was trapped. The only way out was up, deeper into the bristlecone's twisted branches. I climbed higher, Jake's terrified eyes following my movement. As I reached the upper branches, I could see that the tree was even larger than I'd thought. It stretched up into the darkness, its trunk riddled with human shapes in various stages of absorption. Some were recent, their faces still clearly defined. Others had been there longer, their features worn smooth by decades of growth until they were just vague suggestions of humanity in the wood grain. This tree was ancient beyond comprehension, and it had been feeding on people for centuries. The creatures below had started climbing after me, their movements unnaturally fluid as they flowed up the trunk like liquid mercury. I climbed faster, my lungs burning in the thin air, branches breaking under my weight as I reached the tree's outer limits. At the very top, balanced precariously on a branch no thicker than my wrist, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to climb down the other side, I pulled out my emergency flare and ignited it. The red light blazed like a miniature sun, and the creatures below shrieked in unison, a sound like 1,000 fingernails on glass. They fell from the tree like overripe fruit, hitting the ground with wet thuds that definitely didn't sound human. I held the flare as high as I could, praying that someone would see it. In the red light, I could see the full scope of the horror below me. The clearing was filled with writhing shapes that were abandoning their human forms, revealing themselves as something that hurt to look at directly, collections of angles and textures that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. The flare burned for exactly 90 seconds. When it died, the clearing was empty except for the tree and the fading echo of inhuman screams. I climbed down carefully, my hands shaking with adrenaline. Jake was still trapped in the trunk, but his eyes had closed. I couldn't tell if he was unconscious or dead, but the bark around his face had stopped growing. I tried cutting him free again, but it was hopeless. The tree had grown around him like living cement, and I didn't have the tools to free him. The best I could do was promise to bring help, though I had no idea if anyone would believe me. The walk back to civilization took 2 days. I followed the stars and my compass, avoiding the main trails in case those things were still hunting for me. I rationed my water and ate pine nuts and manzanita berries, grateful for the wilderness survival course I'd taken years earlier. When I finally reached the ranger station, I was dehydrated, exhausted, and probably incoherent. I tried to explain what had happened, but the story sounded insane even to me. Missing friend, creatures that could mimic human appearance, a tree that ate people. Who would believe any of it? The Park Service organized a search and rescue operation, but they never found Jake or the ancient tree. According to their report, I had suffered a psychotic break brought on by altitude sickness and dehydration. Jake had apparently fallen into a ravine during the night, and my mind had created an elaborate fantasy to cope with the trauma of losing him. That was 3 months ago. I've been seeing a therapist, taking medication for anxiety and depression, trying to convince myself that the official explanation makes sense. Most of the time, I almost believe it. But sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls from Jake's number. When I answer, there's nothing but the sound of wind through ancient branches and something that might be Jake's voice, very far away, calling my name. The calls always end the same way, with my own voice telling me not to worry, that everything is fine, that I should come back to the forest because Jake is waiting for me. I've changed my number twice, but the calls keep coming. And lately, I've been seeing people who look familiar but wrong, standing across the street from my apartment or sitting in cars outside my work. They wave when they see me looking, smiling, those two wide smiles. I know they're waiting for me to let my guard down, to stop taking the medication, to start doubting the rational explanations. They want me to come back to the forest, to that clearing where the ancient tree grows, but I've learned something that gives me hope. The flare hurt them, and I think I know why. Those things, whatever they are, they're creatures of deception and shadow. They can't stand true light, honest illumination that reveals things as they really are. So I carry flares now, wherever I go, and every night before I sleep, I light a candle and keep it burning until dawn. It's not much protection, but it's something. Because I know that someday they'll stop waiting. Someday they'll come for me directly. And when that happens, I want to be ready. The thing is, I'm starting to suspect they don't need to come for me at all. Every day, I feel myself becoming more like them, more calculating, more predatory. Sometimes I catch myself tilting my head just like they did, or smiling too wide when I talk to people. Maybe that's how it really works. Maybe the tree wasn't just a trap. Maybe it was a chrysalis. Maybe Jake is still alive in there, changing into something new, something hungry. And maybe, just maybe, I brought a little piece of that change back with me. The thought terrifies me, but it also excites me in a way that I know isn't entirely human. I should probably stop writing now. The sun is setting, and I can hear footsteps outside my apartment. They sound like Jake's footsteps, but with that same wrong rhythm I noticed on our first day in the forest. Someone's knocking on my door now. A familiar voice is calling my name, asking me to let him in. He says he escaped, that he's been looking for me for months, that he needs my help. But I can see his shadow under the door, and it's the wrong shape entirely. I'm not going to answer. I'm going to light another flare and wait for morning. But I have to admit, part of me, a part that gets stronger every day, wants to see what he's become. After all, we've always been such good friends. My name is Brandon Edwards, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Sierra Nevada mountains, near Mineral King in Sequoia National Forest, California, during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip with my co-workers. I should have known something was wrong when Marcus volunteered to come. Marcus Hendricks had worked in our IT department for 3 years, and in all that time, I'd never heard him express interest in anything that didn't involve a computer screen. He was pale, thin, and spoke in whispers when he spoke at all. But when our supervisor Jenny announced the company team-building camping trip, Marcus was the first to sign up. "Fresh air will do me good," he said, his voice barely audible above the office air conditioning. There was something in his eyes when he said it, a hunger that made my skin crawl. The group consisted of 5 of us: myself, Jenny Walsh, our department supervisor, Dave Peterson from accounting, Sarah Martinez from HR, and Marcus. We'd chosen Mineral King because of its isolation, a perfect place to disconnect and reconnect, as Jenny put it. The area was notorious for its difficult access road, a winding nightmare of switchbacks that climbed over 7,000 feet into the mountains. Cell service was non-existent, and the nearest ranger station was 20 miles away. We arrived Friday evening, just as the September sun was painting the granite peaks in shades of orange and red. The campground was nearly empty. Just us and an elderly couple at the far end who'd left before we'd even finished setting up our tents. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pine trees and the distant sound of rushing water from the Kauai River. Dave, a stocky man with graying temples and an infectious laugh, immediately began gathering wood for a fire. "This is perfect," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the thin mountain air. No emails, no meetings, no corporate bullshit, just us and nature. Sarah nodded enthusiastically, her dark hair already escaping from her ponytail. She was the office optimist, always organizing birthday parties and group lunches. I brought marshmallows and chocolate. We're making s'mores whether you like it or not." Jenny, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who somehow managed to look professional even in hiking boots and a fleece jacket, was studying a topographical map. "There's a waterfall about 2 miles up the trail," she said. "We could hike there tomorrow morning." Marcus said nothing. He stood at the edge of our campsite, staring into the tree line with an expression I couldn't read. The dying light cast deep shadows across his face, making his eyes appear sunken and dark. "Marcus," I called, "you okay?" He turned slowly, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker across his features, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just listening," he said. "The forest has so much to say." That should have been my first real warning. We spent the evening around the fire sharing stories and drinking beer. The conversation flowed easily, lubricated by alcohol and the novelty of seeing our coworkers outside their usual habitat. Dave told increasingly ridiculous fishing stories, Sarah shared gossip from the HR department, and Jenny revealed a surprisingly wicked sense of humor. Marcus remained mostly silent, occasionally laughing at appropriate moments, but his attention seemed focused elsewhere. I caught him several times staring past the firelight into the darkness beyond our camp. When I followed his gaze, I saw nothing but the black wall of trees, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. "What's out there, Marcus?" I finally asked. He looked at me with those dark eyes, and for a moment I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Old things," he said quietly. "Hungry things that remember when this land belonged to them." The conversation died. We all stared at him, unsure how to respond to such an odd statement. "Well, that's not ominous at all," Dave said finally, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow in the darkness. Marcus smiled, that same strange smile that didn't touch his eyes. Just local folklore. The Yokits tribe used to live in these mountains. They had stories about things that lived in the deep woods, things that could wear the faces of men. "Jesus, Marcus," Sarah said, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. "Way to kill the mood." "Sorry," he said, but he didn't sound sorry. If anything, he seemed pleased by our discomfort. We turned in early, the strange conversation having cast a pall over the evening. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and listened to the sounds of the forest. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through the trees. Gradually, the sounds lulled me toward sleep. I was jolted awake sometime later by a sound I couldn't identify. A low, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It rose and fell like a siren, but there was something organic about it, something that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I lay perfectly still, listening. Around me, I could hear the others stirring in their tents. "What the hell was that?" Dave's voice muffled by nylon. "Probably a coyote," Jenny replied, but she didn't sound convinced. The sound came again, closer this time. It was definitely not a coyote. It was higher, more human, filled with a grief and hunger that made my stomach turn. "Marcus," Sarah called softly. "Marcus, are you awake?" No answer. I unzipped my tent and peered out. The fire had died to glowing embers, casting barely enough light to see the other tents. Marcus's tent, positioned slightly apart from the rest of ours, was dark and still. "Marcus," I called more loudly. Still nothing. The wailing sound came a third time, seeming to emanate from the forest directly behind Marcus's tent. It was answered by another call from deeper in the woods, then another. Soon, the night was filled with a chorus of those terrible voices, calling and responding in some primitive language of loss and need. "Everyone, stay in your tents," Jenny commanded in her supervisor voice. "It's probably just animals. They'll move on." But the sounds didn't move on. They continued for what felt like hours, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always maintaining that quality of wrongness that made sleep impossible. When I finally dozed near dawn, I dreamed of pale figures moving between the trees, their mouths open in silent screams. I woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Dave was already up, tending a small camp stove with the dedication of a man who needed caffeine to function. The morning sun was brilliant, turning the previous night's terrors into something that seemed almost ridiculous in the daylight. "Sleep well?" Dave asked with a grin. "Like a baby," I lied, accepting a cup of coffee gratefully. Sarah emerged from her tent looking haggard, her usually perfect hair a mess of tangles. "Did anyone else have weird dreams? I kept dreaming about something scratching at my tent." "Probably tree branches," Jenny said, but she was looking around the campsite with a frown. "Has anyone seen Marcus?" We all looked toward his tent. It was zipped shut, showing no signs of movement. "Marcus," Dave called. "Rise and shine, buddy." No response. A cold dread began to settle in my stomach. Maybe he's a heavy sleeper. Jenny walked over to his tent and called his name again. When there was still no answer, she hesitated for a moment, then slowly unzipped the tent flap. "Empty," she said, her voice tight. "His sleeping bag is here, but Marcus is gone." We searched the immediate area, calling his name and looking for any sign of where he might have gone. His hiking boots were still in his tent, along with his jacket and backpack. Whatever had happened, he'd left in the middle of the night wearing only his underwear and a t-shirt. "We need to contact the rangers," Sarah said, her voice rising with panic. "With what?" I held up my phone, showing the complete absence of signal bars. "We're 40 miles from the nearest cell tower." "Then we drive out and get help," Jenny decided. "This is serious. People don't just vanish in the wilderness." But when we reached our cars, we discovered that all 4 vehicles had been vandalized. Every tire had been slashed, the cuts too clean and precise to be accidental. Worse, someone had poured sand into the gas tanks. We could see the granules glittering in the morning sun. "What the fuck?" Dave breathed, running his hands through his hair. "Who would do this?" We were stranded. The nearest road was a 20-mile hike through some of the most remote wilderness in California. Even if we started immediately, it would take us the better part of 2 days to reach help, assuming we didn't get lost. "We stick together," Jenny said, slipping into crisis management mode. "We make a plan. We execute the plan. First priority is finding Marcus. Second is getting out of here." We spent the morning searching in ever-widening circles around our campsite. The forest was dense here, filled with massive granite boulders and thick stands of pine and fir. Visibility was limited, and the terrain was treacherous, loose rock and steep slopes that could easily result in a broken ankle or worse. It was Sarah who found the first sign of Marcus. "Over here," she called from a grove of aspens about a quarter-mile from camp. "I found something." We hurried to where she stood, staring down at the ground with a pale face. There, pressed into a patch of soft earth, was a perfect human footprint. But something was wrong with it. The toes were too long, the arch too pronounced, and there were what looked like claw marks extending from where the tips of the toes should be. "That's not human," Dave said quietly. "But it's wearing Marcus's foot," I added, recognizing the distinctive scar on the heel from where Marcus had stepped on a nail as a child, a detail he'd shared during a rare moment of openness at a company barbecue. Jenny knelt beside the print, her face grave. There are more leading deeper into the forest. The tracks formed a clear trail, though they became increasingly difficult to follow as the ground grew rocky. But there was something deeply unsettling about them. They seemed to change as we followed them, sometimes appearing human, sometimes more animal-like, as if whatever was making them was shifting between forms with each step. The trail led us up a steep slope toward a section of forest I'd noticed on the map, an area marked only as uncharted territory in small print. The trees here were older, more massive, their trunks so wide that it would take several people holding hands to circle them. The canopy above was so thick that even the bright morning sun penetrated only in thin, golden shafts. "This feels wrong," Sarah whispered, unconsciously moving closer to Dave. She was right. There was something fundamentally off about this part of the forest. The air was colder here, and it carried scents that didn't belong, Iron and decay and something else, something wild and predatory. More disturbing was the silence. No birds sang here, no squirrels chattered, no insects buzzed. It was as if the normal life of the forest had fled this place. The tracks led to a clearing dominated by a circle of standing stones. They weren't natural formations. Someone had arranged them with deliberate care, creating a ring about 20 feet across. The stones themselves were covered in what looked like primitive carvings, symbols that hurt to look at directly. And in the center of the circle was Marcus. He sat cross-legged on the ground, perfectly naked, his back to us. His skin was pale as milk in the filtered sunlight, and he was completely motionless. "Marcus!" Sarah called, starting forward. I grabbed her arm. "Wait!" Something was wrong. Marcus didn't react to our voices at all. He didn't even seem to be breathing. "Marcus!" Jenny called more cautiously. "Can you hear us?" Still no response. We approached slowly, forming a loose semicircle behind him. Up close, I could see that his skin was covered in what looked like writing, the same primitive symbols that decorated the stones, carved into his flesh with something sharp. The cuts were precise, methodical, and there was no blood. "Jesus Christ," Dave breathed. "What happened to him?" That's when Marcus slowly turned his head to look at us over his shoulder. The movement was wrong. Too fluid, too far, as if his neck had too many joints. And his face. It was Marcus's face, but it wasn't. The features were correct. Same nose, same jawline, same brown eyes. But the expression was alien, predatory, filled with an intelligence that was definitely not human. When he smiled, I saw that his teeth had been filed to points. "Hello," he said in Marcus's voice, though it carried harmonics that made my bones ache. "I've been waiting for you," Sarah screamed. The thing wearing Marcus's face laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and began to stand. Its movements were all wrong, joints bending in impossible directions, limbs extending farther than they should. When it reached its full height, it was at least 7 feet tall, though it had somehow maintained Marcus's basic proportions. "Run," Jenny said quietly. "Run!" she screamed when none of us moved. We ran. Behind us, the thing that had been Marcus let out another of those terrible laughs, followed by a sound I'll never forget. A wet, tearing noise, as if something was shedding its skin. I didn't look back, but I could hear it following us, crashing through the underbrush with inhuman speed. We plunged down the slope, abandoning any pretense of staying on the trail. Branches whipped at our faces, rocks turned under our feet, and the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer. Sarah was crying as she ran, great sobbing gasps that echoed through the forest. "The camp!" Jenny shouted. "Get to the camp!" But when we broke through the tree line into our campsite, we found chaos. Our tents had been shredded, their contents scattered across the ground. Our food had been torn open and mixed with dirt and pine needles. Worst of all, someone, or something, had written a message in what looked like blood across a nearby tree trunk. "Feed the hunger." "The cars," Dave panted. "Maybe we can—" A sound from the forest cut him off. That same wet, tearing noise, but louder now, accompanied by something that might have been Marcus's voice if Marcus had been screaming through a throat full of broken glass. "It's coming," Sarah whispered. We huddled together in the center of the destroyed campsite, looking wildly around for weapons or shelter. Dave grabbed a large branch from our firewood pile while Jenny picked up a heavy flashlight. I found a hunting knife in the wreckage of my tent and gripped it with shaking hands. The sounds stopped. The forest around us was completely silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Even our own breathing seemed unnaturally loud. We stood back to back in a tight circle, waiting for something to happen. "Where is it?" Sarah whispered. That's when we heard Marcus's voice coming from directly above us. "Here." We looked up to see the thing clinging to the trunk of a massive pine tree, 50 feet above the ground. It was naked and pale, its limbs elongated and wrong, but its face was still recognizably Marcus's. It began to descend head first, moving like a spider, its fingers and toes somehow finding purchase on the bark. Dave hurled his branch at it. The thing caught it one-handed without breaking its descent and snapped it in half like a toothpick. "Scatter!" Jenny yelled. We broke apart, each running in a different direction. I heard Sarah scream from somewhere behind me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The primal terror flooding my system had reduced me to nothing but the need to run, to put distance between myself and that abomination. I crashed through the forest blindly, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of struggle, shouting, screaming, and underneath it all, that terrible, wet laughter. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, finally collapsing behind a fallen log about half a mile from camp. My lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to lie still and listen. The forest was quiet again. I waited for what felt like hours, fighting the urge to call out for the others. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I finally worked up the courage to make my way back toward camp. I found Dave first. He was hanging from a tree branch about 20 feet from where we'd separated, suspended by what looked like his own intestines. His face was locked in an expression of absolute terror, and his eyes had been carved out. Written on his forehead in blood were those same primitive symbols I'd seen on the stones. I vomited until there was nothing left in my stomach, then forced myself to keep moving. Jenny was next. I found her body arranged in the center of the stone circle, positioned exactly where we'd discovered the thing that had been Marcus. Her arms and legs had been broken and twisted into impossible angles, creating the rough shape of one of those alien symbols. She was still alive when I found her, but barely. Her eyes tracked to me as I approached, and her lips moved soundlessly, trying to form words. I knelt beside her, fighting another wave of nausea. "Jenny? Can you hear me?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she managed to speak. "Not Marcus. Never was Marcus." She died before she could say anything else. I searched for Sarah until full darkness fell, but found no trace of her. Part of me hoped she'd escaped, but a larger part feared something worse, that she'd suffered the same fate as the others, and I simply hadn't found her body yet. As night settled over the forest, I made a decision. I couldn't wait for rescue that might never come. I had to try to reach the road on my own, even if it meant hiking 20 miles through this nightmare landscape in the dark. I gathered what supplies I could find in the wreckage of our camp: a water bottle, some energy bars that hadn't been contaminated, and Jenny's heavy-duty flashlight. The beam was reassuringly bright, carving a cone of white light through the darkness. I was just about to leave when I heard Sarah's voice calling from the forest. "Brandon, Brandon, where are you? I'm hurt." I froze. The voice was definitely Sarah's, but something about it made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the timing, too convenient, coming just as I was about to leave. Maybe it was the tone, too calm for someone who was supposedly injured and lost in the dark woods. "Sarah?" I called back cautiously. "Thank God. I'm over here, by the big rock. I think my ankle is broken." I moved toward the sound of her voice, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the trees. The voice had come from the direction of the stone circle, which immediately put me on edge. "Keep talking so I can find you. I'm right here. Follow my voice." But as I got closer, I realized the voice wasn't moving. Sarah was supposedly injured and stationary, but her voice remained at exactly the same volume and distance no matter how far I walked. It was as if the sound was being projected from a fixed point rather than coming from a living person. I stopped walking and turned off my flashlight, plunging myself into complete darkness. "Sarah," I called. "I'm right here." The voice was definitely coming from the stone circle. "Why did you turn off your light? I can't see anything." But here's the thing. If Sarah was really in the stone circle, and if she really couldn't see anything, how did she know I'd turned off my flashlight? I stayed perfectly still, listening. After a few minutes, I heard a new sound. Footsteps, but wrong. Too many of them, as if something with more than 2 legs was walking upright. They moved in a circle around the stones, and with each pass, Sarah's voice called out again. "Brandon, I'm scared. Please help me." The thing was hunting me, using Sarah's voice as bait. But what had happened to the real Sarah? Was she dead like the others, or was she somewhere else entirely? And, more importantly, was the thing in the circle actually the same entity that had worn Marcus's face, or was there more than one of these abominations? I didn't wait to find out. Moving as quietly as possible, I crept away from the stone circle and began my long journey toward the road. The hike was a nightmare. Without GPS or landmarks, I had to navigate by memory and the faint glow of stars visible through the canopy. Every sound made me jump. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Twice I heard Sarah's voice calling from different directions, pleading for help, but I kept moving. The worst part was the growing certainty that I was being followed. I never saw anything when I turned around, but I could feel eyes watching me, and occasionally I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Something was keeping pace with me through the trees, staying just outside the range of my flashlight. Around midnight, I heard a new voice. "Brandon!" It was Dave, calling from somewhere behind me. His voice was strong and clear, showing no signs of the trauma I'd witnessed. "Brandon, wait up. We're okay. We found Sarah." I kept walking. "Marcus wasn't really possessed," Dave's voice continued. "It was just hypothermia. He's fine now. We're all fine." The voice was coming from the same direction as the sounds of pursuit, which confirmed what I already knew. It wasn't really Dave. Whatever was following me could mimic their voices perfectly, but it didn't understand human psychology well enough to craft convincing lies. Dave, the real Dave, was dead. I'd seen his body. The fake voice grew more frantic as I continued to ignore it. "Brandon, please. Sarah is badly hurt. We need your help." Then Jenny's voice joined the chorus. "This is a direct order. You come back here right now." Soon, all 3 voices were calling from the darkness behind me, sometimes speaking in unison, sometimes overlapping in ways that created disturbing harmonies. The words became less coherent as the night wore on, degenerating into pleading, then threats, then finally into wordless screams of rage and hunger. I hiked through the night, stopping only when exhaustion forced me to rest. Each time I paused, the voices would grow closer, forcing me back to my feet. By dawn, my legs were shaking and my water was nearly gone, but I could see something ahead that made my heart leap, the distant gleam of metal. The road. I stumbled the last quarter mile, tears of relief streaming down my face. The asphalt was cracked and weathered, but it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I was back in civilization, back in the world of humans. I started walking south, toward the main highway. According to my calculations, it was still about 5 miles to reach a point where my cell phone might get signal, but those 5 miles felt manageable after what I'd been through. I'd been walking for about an hour when I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. A park ranger's truck rounded the bend and I nearly collapsed with relief. I waved frantically and the truck pulled over. The ranger who got out was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes. "Sir, are you all right? You look like you've been through hell." I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out as incoherent babble. She helped me into the truck and gave me water while I struggled to collect myself enough to speak clearly. "Take your time," she said gently. "Start from the beginning." I told her everything. The camping trip, Marcus's disappearance, the thing in the stone circle, the deaths of my friends. She listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. "Sir," she said when I finished, "I need you to understand something. There was no Marcus Hendricks on the camping permit filed for that site." I stared at her. "What do you mean?" "I have the paperwork right here." She pulled out a folder from her glove compartment. 4 permits were issued for that site this weekend. Brandon Edwards, Jenny Walsh, Dave Peterson, and Sarah Martinez. No Marcus Hendricks. The world seemed to tilt around me. That's impossible. Marcus works with us. He's been in our department for 3 years. The ranger's expression was sympathetic but firm. Sir, I think you've been through a severe trauma. Sometimes our minds create false memories to help us cope with. No. I grabbed the paperwork from her hands, scanning it frantically. She was right. Only 4 names were listed. But that was impossible. Marcus had been there. I'd talked to him, worked with him for years. Hadn't I? I tried to recall specific conversations with Marcus, specific projects we'd worked on together. But the harder I tried to focus on those memories, the more they seemed to slip away, like trying to hold water in my cupped hands. We need to go back, I said desperately. There are bodies. Dave and Jenny are dead. The ranger nodded. We'll definitely investigate. But right now, you need medical attention. She radioed for additional rangers and a medical team, then drove me to the nearest hospital. The doctors found me severely dehydrated and suffering from what they termed acute psychological trauma. They sedated me and kept me for observation. When I woke up 12 hours later, a police detective was waiting to interview me. He told me that a full search and rescue operation had been conducted at the campsite. They'd found our vandalized cars and the destroyed camp, but no bodies, no blood, no sign of violence beyond the property damage. What about the stone circle? I asked. The symbols carved into the trees? The detective consulted his notes. No stone circle was found in that area, Mr. Edwards, and no carved symbols. Are you sure you didn't hit your head during your time in the wilderness? They released me 2 days later with a referral to a psychiatrist and a recommendation that I take some time off work. The official report classified the incident as a case of exposure-induced hallucinations combined with possible head trauma. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to my friends. More disturbing, when I returned to work a week later, I discovered that no one else remembered Marcus either. When I asked about him, my colleagues looked at me strangely. According to HR, no Marcus Hendricks had ever worked for our company. I've spent months researching the area where we camped, digging through local folklore and historical records. What I found didn't make me feel any better. The Yokuts tribe did indeed have legends about that region. They spoke of creatures called the Achek, shapeshifters that could wear human form and infiltrate communities. According to the stories, an Achek would study its prey for months or even years before making its move, learning their habits, their relationships, their weaknesses. They fed on human flesh. But more than that, they fed on human connections. When an Achek killed someone, it didn't just destroy their body, it erased them from the world entirely, consuming even the memories others had of them. The legend said that sometimes, very rarely, someone would survive an encounter with an Achek. These survivors would be left with memories of friends and loved ones that no one else could remember, driving them slowly insane with the knowledge that entire lives had been stolen from existence. I think about Marcus now, or the thing that wore Marcus's face, and I wonder how long it had been studying us. Had there ever been a real Marcus Hendricks? Or had the creature been part of our lives from the very beginning, slowly working its way into our group until it was time to feed? I don't work at that company anymore. I don't work anywhere, really. It's hard to function in a world where you remember people who never existed, where you carry the grief of friends whose deaths no one believes happened. Sometimes, late at night, I hear Sarah's voice calling my name from the darkness outside my apartment. I never answer. I never look. But I'm starting to understand that this isn't over. The thing didn't just feed on my friends, it tasted me too, and now it knows where I live. Last week, I met my new neighbor. Nice guy, very quiet. Says his name is Marcus. He has the same dark eyes, the same way of staring just a little too long, and when he smiles, I swear I can see the ghost of pointed teeth. I'm writing this down because I need someone to remember. If I disappear, if everyone forgets I ever existed, At least this will remain as proof that Brandon Edwards was real, that his friends were real, that their deaths mattered. The thing is patient. It can wait months, years, decades, but eventually it will come for me. I can feel it watching me right now, as I write these words. I can hear it moving around in the apartment next door, doing whatever it does when it thinks no one is listening. It sounds like it's shedding something. It sounds hungry. If you're reading this, and if you remember me at all, please don't let them convince you I was crazy. Please don't let them erase the memory of Jenny and Dave and Sarah. Please remember that we were real. The knocking on my door just started. It's using Sarah's voice again.